Hello everyone, and welcome back to Mr. Sleepy Crime. I know many of you enjoy listening to these stories as you fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from. And if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps the channel grow. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that this story involves real people and real tragedies. We tell these stories not for entertainment, but to remember the victims and perhaps help others recognize the warning signs that could prevent similar tragedies. For the best experience, feel free to lower the volume a little, just enough to let the story gently carry you off to sleep. Alright, please get comfortable, dim the lights, and let's dive into tonight's first story. Tonight we're traveling to the quiet market town of Richmond, in North Yorkshire, England. It's a place of cobbled streets and ancient stone buildings, where the River Swale cuts through rolling green countryside. This is a story about deception, jealousy, and the painstaking work of investigators who had to build a murder case without the most crucial piece of evidence: a body. This is the story of Jenny Nichol, a 19-year-old woman with a guitar and dreams, whose disappearance in the summer of 2005 would lead to one of the most unusual murder convictions in British legal history. So, as we settle in, let me tell you what happened on that Thursday evening in June, and the investigation that followed. Jenny Nichol was the kind of young woman who brought energy into a room. At 19 years old, she had shoulder-length hair, a warm smile, and calloused fingers from hours spent playing guitar. She worked at the local co-op supermarket during the day, but music was her passion. In the evenings, you could find her on stage at local pubs, her fingers moving across the fretboard as she played rock covers with her band. No fouling. Jenny was a Jimi Hendrix fan through and through. She'd discovered his music as a teenager and had been captivated ever since. The raw emotion, the technical brilliance, the way he could make a guitar sing or scream. She practiced constantly, determined to master his techniques. And her dedication showed. She'd even performed at the Richmond Live Music Festival, standing under the lights, lost in the music she loved. The Nichol family had settled in Richmond because of the British Army. Jenny's father, Brian, was a retired Army major, and when Jenny's older brother James joined the military and was posted to nearby Catterick Garrison, the family made Richmond their permanent home. It was a tight-knit military community, where everyone seemed to know everyone else. Jenny had an active social life. She'd go camping with friends, play in the local pool league, and spend evenings at the pubs around town. She was known and recognized, liked. Her parents, Brian and Anne, were used to Jenny's independence. At 19, it wasn't unusual for her to spend nights at friends' houses or go on spontaneous camping trips. They trusted her, but there was something in Jenny's life that her parents didn't know about. Something that had begun 5 years earlier when she was just 14 years old, sitting in a classroom at St. Francis Xavier School. David Hodgson was 45 years old in the summer of 2005. He was married with 2 daughters who attended the same school as Jenny. He worked occasionally as a fence erector and gardener. Though he spent long periods unemployed, to many who knew him, he seemed unremarkable, just another middle-aged man in a small town. But David Hodgson had a secret, and that secret involved Jenny Nichol. It had started when Jenny was 14. Hodgson had known her through his daughters. They were schoolmates, friends who would visit each other's homes. Somewhere in those innocent interactions, something dark had taken root. Hodgson began grooming Jenny, a process so gradual and insidious that even Jenny herself might not have fully understood what was happening. He would later claim that their relationship didn't become sexual until Jenny turned 16. The age of consent in England. He would say they'd only had sex 5 times. But the truth, as investigators would piece together, was far more disturbing. This was a man in his 40s who had systematically manipulated a teenager, isolating her, making her dependent on his attention, creating a relationship built on a profound power imbalance. Around the time this abuse began, Jenny experienced bullying at school. There was name-calling, then an assault serious enough that police became involved. Whether this bullying was connected to rumors about her relationship with Hodgson, no one could say for certain, but the timing was notable. As Jenny grew older, the relationship continued in the shadows. They would meet in secret locations, specifically in ramshackle wooden huts that Hodgson and his friends had built in Sandeck Plantation, a wooded area on the outskirts of Richmond These weren't proper buildings, just rough shelters where Hodgson and his circle would gather to play cards and drink. But they offered privacy, isolation, and concealment. And David Hodgson was intensely possessive. According to those who knew about the relationship, he would kick off his temper flaring into jealous rages whenever he saw Jenny talking to other men. He wanted to control who she spoke to, where she went, what she did. For a young woman trying to build an independent life, playing guitar in bands, working at the supermarket, socializing with friends her own age. This possessiveness must have become suffocating. Then, in the weeks leading up to June 2005, something changed. Jenny had met someone new, someone closer to her own age, someone she could be with openly, without secrecy and shame. The twist that would make this case even more complicated, that someone was Robert Hodgson, David's older brother. Thursday, June 30, 2005, seemed like an ordinary summer day in Richmond. The weather was warm, the kind of evening where the light lingers long into the night. At the Nickel home, Jenny was preparing to go out. This wasn't unusual. Her parents were accustomed to Jenny's active social life, her tendency to stay with friends overnight, especially when camping. That evening, Jenny told her parents she was spending the night with friends. She gathered some items, the kinds of things you'd take camping, and said her goodbyes. At 6 o'clock in the evening, she left the house. Ann Nickel watched her daughter walk away. She had no reason to worry, no premonition that anything was wrong. Jenny would be back in a day or two, with stories to tell and probably mud on her boots. That's what Ann expected. That was the last time Ann Nickel saw her daughter alive. The next few days passed without word from Jenny. At first, this wasn't alarming. Jenny was independent. And if she was camping with friends, she might not have phone signal or might simply be enjoying being disconnected for a while. But by Monday, July 4th, Ann and Brian's concern had grown into worry, and worry into fear. They tried calling Jenny's phone. No answer. They contacted her friends. No one had seen her. They drove to places she liked to visit. Nothing. On July 4th, they made a discovery that turned their fear into full-blown panic. Jenny's car, a white Rover 2014, was found parked in the lot of the Holly Hill Inn on the outskirts of Richmond. It had been sitting there for days. Inside, investigators found something both hopeful and puzzling. Badges that Jenny had been planning to sew onto a teddy bear for a friend. The badges were there. The teddy bear wasn't. Brian and Ann reported their daughter missing. North Yorkshire police launched a missing person investigation. The first days of any disappearance are critical, and they moved quickly, conducting searches of the surrounding countryside, interviewing Jenny's friends and family, reviewing CCTV footage from around Richmond. They circulated Jenny's description to every police force in the country. They visited every pub in the area. Jenny was well known in the local music scene, a familiar face in the pool leagues and at open mic nights. Detectives conducted house-to-house inquiries around Richmond, particularly near Holly Hill where her car had been found. The investigation team set up appeals at rock music events across the region, knowing that Jenny was a devoted rock fan and might have gone to a concert or festival. They studied hours of CCTV footage, looking for any sign of where Jenny might have gone after leaving her car. But by early July, 9 days after Jenny's disappearance, police attention turned to David Hodgson. During the initial interviews, Hodgson was calm, cooperative. He denied having anything to do with Jenny's disappearance. He denied that he had abused her. He denied everything. He was just a family man. He seemed to suggest, caught up in a terrible situation through no fault of his own. Then, the day after that first interview, something strange happened. Jenny's mobile phone, silent since her disappearance, suddenly activated. Messages began arriving. Texts sent from Jenny's phone to her friends and family. The messages said she was fine. She was alive, traveling, not to worry about her. Hope, fragile and desperate, flared in the hearts of Ann and Brian Nickel. Maybe their daughter really was okay. Maybe she'd simply decided to run away, to start fresh somewhere new. But as more messages arrived over the following days and weeks, doubts began to creep in. Something about these texts felt wrong. The text messages that appeared to come from Jenny were sent to her father, Brian, and 2 of her close friends. They spoke of being in Scotland, of living with a boyfriend, of needing to get away from Richmond. Everyone hates me in Richmond. One message read, "You are the only mate I have got." Ann Nickel, clinging to the possibility that her daughter was alive, traveled to the locations suggested by the phone signals. One message had been sent from Carlisle in Cumbria, another from Jedburgh in the Scottish borders. Anne went to both places, walking the streets, showing Jenny's photo to shopkeepers and passers-by, desperately hoping someone had seen her daughter. But no one had. It was as if Jenny had become a ghost present only through electronic signals, but nowhere to be found in the physical world. Meanwhile, forensic linguists had been brought in to analyze the messages. This was relatively new territory in 2005, using linguistic analysis to determine the authorship of text messages. But the science was sound. People have distinctive writing styles, even in abbreviated text messages. They make consistent choices about abbreviations, punctuation, grammar, and word choice. Dr. Malcolm Coulthard, a forensic linguist, examined messages known to have been written by Jenny and compared them to the messages sent after her disappearance. He identified 9 specific stylistic features that distinguish Jenny's texting style from others. For example, Jenny consistently used my and myself in her messages. The messages sent after her disappearance used me and meself, a Yorkshire dialect pattern. Jenny would write I am without abbreviation or sometimes in without an apostrophe. The later messages used different patterns. Jenny had a particular way of using to for to. She would write can't today without a space. The style in the newer messages was different. Small details, yes, but consistent, revealing. The linguistic analysis suggested something disturbing. The messages sent from Jenny's phone after she disappeared had not been written by Jenny. They'd been written by someone else trying to impersonate her, and the linguistic patterns most closely matched the writing style of David Hodgson. At the end of July 2005, police found David Hodgson in one of his makeshift huts near Hudswell. He had taken an overdose of pills, washing them down with wine. It was a suicide attempt, whether genuine or performative. Only Hodgson could say. He survived. And in subsequent interviews, his story began to change. Now he admitted that yes, he and Jenny had been lovers. But he claimed their affair had ended 12 months earlier. He hadn't seen her, hadn't spoken to her. He knew nothing about where she might be. This new version of events contradicted his earlier denials. Police noted the inconsistency, but more importantly, they noted something else. David's brother, Robert Hodgson, had also attempted suicide in the weeks following Jenny's disappearance. 2 brothers, both in relationships with the same teenage girl, both attempting to take their own lives after she vanished. The coincidence was striking. During the investigation, Robert Hodgson claimed he'd been unaware of Jenny's relationship with his younger brother, David. This seemed implausible to investigators. The 2 brothers had worked together building the huts in Sandbeck Plantation, the very places where David and Jenny would meet in secret. Could Robert really have been oblivious? The prosecution would later theorize that David Hodgson had discovered Jenny's growing closeness to Robert. In his possessive, jealous mind, this would have been the ultimate betrayal, not just losing Jenny, but losing her to his own brother. Rage and humiliation would have overwhelmed him. But without a body, without a crime scene, without any witness to what happened that night of June 30th, how could they prove murder? Throughout the summer and autumn of 2005, the search for Jenny continued. It was massive in scope, methodical in execution. Over 150 locations were searched, across North Yorkshire, Scotland, and the Lake District. Soldiers from the nearby Catterick garrison volunteered to help, combing through fields and forests. They searched septic tanks at farms, checked disused wells, explored abandoned buildings. The Marine unit from Northumbria. Police examined a well at Hudswell Grange. Even though it was covered, there was a small gap where something could have been dropped. Teams scoured Badgerbeck Wood. They searched Sandbeck Plantation multiple times. In November 2005, the investigation officially changed status from a missing person case to a murder inquiry. The text messages, the linguistic analysis, Hodgson's changing stories, his suicide attempt, all of it pointed toward foul play. Police publicly stated they believed Jenny was dead. By November, the investigation took a dark and unexpected turn. As part of their inquiries, police had examined Jenny's father's computer, looking for any online contacts Jenny might have made, any clues about where she might have gone. What they found had nothing to do with Jenny's disappearance, but it shattered the family further. Thousands of images of child abuse downloaded onto the machine. Brian Nichol was charged and given a community rehabilitation order after admitting to the offenses. The images were not connected to Jenny in any way, but the revelation added another layer of tragedy and shame to a family already devastated by their daughter's disappearance. Then, in December 2005, Anne Nichol appeared on the BBC's Crime Watch program. She sat before the cameras, composed but clearly anguished, and appealed directly to anyone who might have information about Jenny. The broadcast generated several helpful calls, leads that police followed up on, but still no Jenny. And then finally a breakthrough. Not in finding Jenny, but in finding evidence that would prove crucial to the case against David Hodgson. Brian and Anne Nichol had not simply waited for police to search for their daughter. They'd gone out themselves, walking the woods and fields around Richmond, looking in places that held meaning for Jenny. Places she might have gone. One day searching through Sandbeck Plantation, the wooded area where David Hodgson's makeshift huts were hidden, they made a discovery that brought both hope and horror. Hidden under leaves, they found Jenny's nightdress. Nearby, they found her cosmetics. Later searches of the area turned up more items. Jenny's CD player and the teddy bear, the one that should have had badges sewn onto it, but never did. These weren't items Jenny would have abandoned if she'd run away to start a new life. These were items that had been hidden, concealed, disposed of. They were evidence of a crime. The Sandbeck Plantation huts became the focus of intense forensic investigation. Police discovered DNA evidence in one of the wooden structures. Evidence that Jenny and David Hodgson had been there together, had been intimate there. This corroborated what investigators had suspected about their relationship. But there was still no body. Without remains, without a crime scene where murder had occurred, without a disposal site, building a murder case would be extraordinarily difficult. Prosecutors would need to construct a narrative from circumstantial evidence. The text messages, the linguistic analysis, the DNA, Jenny's possessions hidden in the woods, Hodgson's lies and changing stories. In August 2005, a local man had been arrested for allegedly attempting to pervert the course of justice in connection with the case. He was later released without further action. Then in January 2006, two men were arrested on suspicion of Jenny's murder. One was released without charge. The other, David Hodgson, remained in custody. But there still wasn't enough evidence to charge him. He was released, and the investigation continued. Over the following months, investigators painstakingly assembled their case. They analyzed Hodgson's movements in the days after Jenny disappeared. They obtained records of car rentals, and they discovered something remarkable. David Hodgson had hired cars on July 9th and July 14th, 2005, dates that corresponded exactly with when the fraudulent text messages had been sent from Jenny's phone. More specifically, the distances traveled in those rental cars matched the distances from Richmond to Carlisle, and from Richmond to Jedburgh, the locations where Jenny's phone had pinged cell towers when those messages were sent. This wasn't coincidence. This was deliberate deception. Hodgson had taken Jenny's phone, driven hundreds of miles to send messages that would make it appear she was alive and traveling, then driven back. He'd been creating a false trail, a digital ghost of Jenny Nichol moving through Scotland and northern England. The linguistic evidence was damning. The rental car records were damning. The DNA evidence placed them together. Jenny's belongings hidden in the plantation suggested violence, concealment, disposal. In May 2007, nearly 2 years after Jenny's disappearance, police finally had enough. David Hodgson was formally charged with murder. He appeared at Northallerton Magistrates Court and was remanded in custody pending trial. The trial began in January 2008 at Teesside Crown Court. It would last 5 weeks, and throughout those weeks, the Nichol family would endure an ordeal almost as painful as losing Jenny herself. David Hodgson pleaded not guilty. His defense strategy was aggressive and cruel. He claimed Jenny had run away from home to escape her abusive father. He painted Brian Nichol as a violent, controlling man. He suggested Jenny had been desperate to get away from her family. There wasn't the slightest shred of supporting evidence for these claims, as the judge would later note. But Hodgson's defense team was doing what defense teams do, creating reasonable doubt, attacking the credibility of the prosecution's narrative. For Anne and Brian Nichol, sitting in the courtroom day after day, it felt like they and their daughter were the ones on trial. Details of Jenny's private life were exposed. Her relationships, her social activities, intimate aspects of her life that parents rarely know about their adult children. The defense questioned them about aspects of family life, about their parenting, about their daughter's choices. Anne wept on the witness stand as she described finding Jenny's nightdress and cosmetics in Sandbeck Plantation. She described the last time she saw Jenny, walking out the door on that June evening. She described the months of waiting, hoping, searching. The prosecution laid out their case methodically. James Goss QC explained to the jury that while there was no body, no definitive crime scene, the circumstantial evidence was overwhelming. They presented the linguistic analysis, showing how the text messages had been written by someone mimicking Jenny's style, but betraying themselves through consistent grammatical and stylistic choices. They showed the rental car records, the matching distances, the timeline that proved Hodgson had been in the right places at the right times to send those messages. They presented the DNA evidence from the Sandbeck huts. They showed Jenny's possessions, abandoned and hidden. They demonstrated Hodgson's pattern of lies, first denying any relationship with Jenny, then admitting to one but claiming it had ended a year earlier, then changing his story again. Most importantly, they established motive. Hodgson had been possessively jealous of Jenny. He couldn't tolerate her having relationships with other men, and when he discovered she was growing close to his own brother, Robert, something inside him had snapped. The prosecution's theory was this. On the night of June 30th, 2005, David Hodgson had met Jenny, probably at one of their usual meeting spots in Sandbeck Plantation. Perhaps they'd argued about Robert. Perhaps Jenny had told him their relationship was over, that she wanted to be with someone her own age, someone she didn't have to hide. Perhaps Hodgson's jealous rage had simply exploded. Whatever the exact sequence of events, the prosecution argued Hodgson had killed Jenny Nickel that night and disposed of her body somewhere in the surrounding countryside with the intention that it would never be found. After 5 weeks of testimony and evidence, the case went to the jury. They deliberated on the evidence. The text messages that weren't written by Jenny, the rental cars driven to remote locations, the DNA in the woodland huts, the possessions buried under leaves, the web of lies that had unraveled under investigation. On February 19, 2008, the jury returned their verdict. Guilty of murder. David Hodgson showed no reaction. He'd maintained his innocence throughout, claiming he had no contact with Jenny after she disappeared, inventing stories about her running away, attempting to blame her father for abuse that never happened. Mr. Justice Openshaw sentenced him to life in prison with a minimum term of 18 years before he could be considered for parole. The judge was scathing in his remarks, noting that Hodgson had made false allegations against Jenny's father, without the slightest shred of supporting evidence. But even with the conviction, one question remained unanswered. Where was Jenny? After the trial, David Hodgson was led away to begin his sentence. He had been convicted of murder without a body, without a definitive crime scene, without being able to point to a specific location and say, this is where Jenny died. The conviction was a testament to modern forensic techniques, particularly forensic linguistics, which was formally recognized as a specialty by the Council for the Registration of Forensic Practitioners in September 2008, partly because of its crucial role in cases like this one. But for Anne and Brian Nickel, the conviction brought only partial closure. Their daughter was dead. They'd known that really since those first days after her disappearance. But not knowing where she was, not being able to lay her to rest properly, not being able to visit a grave and sit with her memory, that wound remained open. Detective Chief Inspector Pete Martin, who'd led the investigation, spoke to the media after the conviction. David Hodgson has never admitted his guilt and has refused to reveal where he left Jenny, he said. He has shown not the slightest hint of remorse or humanity towards Jenny's family throughout their ordeal. He is a truly callous and heartless individual. The searches continued for a time after the conviction. Police were still hopeful that someone, a hiker, a farmer, someone exploring the countryside, might stumble upon something that would lead them to Jenny's remains. Tips were followed up. Areas were researched. But nothing was found. In 2015, on the 10th anniversary of Jenny's disappearance, DCI Martin spoke again about the case. His message was the same. It is still possible that a member of the public, for example, someone walking in the area, may come across something of significance. In 2019, a new law was passed in the UK, dubbed Helen's Law, after another murder victim whose body was never found. The law required the parole board to take into account a killer's refusal to disclose the location of their victims' remains when considering them for release. It was a provision that gave some comfort to families like the Nichols. Anne and Brian welcomed the change. "We know it will rattle him," they said of Hodgson. "And we know if he continues this denial, the likelihood is he won't be going anywhere." By 2025, David Hodgson would be 60 years old. His minimum 18-year sentence would end around 2026. But without admitting his crime, without revealing where Jenny's body lies, his chances of parole would be slim. Some have speculated about where Jenny might be. The obvious location would be somewhere in or near Sandbeck Plantation, the area Hodgson knew well, where he'd built his hidden huts, where Jenny's belongings were found. But extensive searches of that area found nothing. Perhaps he'd buried her in one of the numerous wooded areas around Richmond. Perhaps in the moorland beyond the town. Perhaps in a location that had personal significance only to him. Or perhaps, as some investigators privately believed, he'd hidden her body so well, perhaps in one of the area's many old wells, or buried deep in the forest, that it simply would never be found. Jenny Nichol is remembered by those who knew her as a vibrant young woman with a passion for music. She was the girl with the guitar, fingers flying over the strings, recreating Hendrix solos in smoky pub backrooms. She was the co-worker who'd chat with customers at the co-op. She was the friend who'd go camping on a moment's notice. She was the daughter who'd kiss her mother goodbye on a June evening, promising to be back in a day or two. She was 19 years old when her life was cut short. 19 years of memories, experiences, relationships, dreams, all of it ended in a moment of violence in a woodland clearing by a man who had abused his position of trust and power, who had groomed a teenager and then killed her when she tried to escape his control. The case stands as a landmark in British legal history, one of the relatively rare no-body murder convictions, and a case that helped establish forensic linguistics as a legitimate tool in criminal investigations. The careful analysis of text messages, the matching of linguistic patterns, helped prove what the physical evidence suggested, that David Hodgson had not only killed Jenny Nichol, but had tried to create an elaborate illusion that she was still alive. But beyond the legal precedents and forensic innovations, this is a story about a family's loss. Anne and Brian Nichols still live in Richmond. They still hope that one day, perhaps, someone will find their daughter, that they'll finally be able to bring her home, to lay her to rest, to have a place where they can go to feel close to her. Until then, Jenny remains out there somewhere, in the North Yorkshire countryside, perhaps under the leaves in Sandbeck Plantation, perhaps in the moorland beyond the town, perhaps somewhere only David Hodgson knows. And David Hodgson, serving his life sentence, has never said a word. The case remains technically open. The investigation into the location of Jenny Nichols continues. Even now, 2 decades later, if you ever find yourself walking in the countryside around Richmond, in the forests or the moorland, keep your eyes open. You never know what you might find. And if you do find something, anything that seems unusual or significant, contact North Yorkshire Police. Give Jenny's family the closure they've been seeking for all these years. That's the story of Jenny Nichol, the 19-year-old musician who disappeared on a summer evening in 2005 and was never seen again. A story of manipulation, jealousy, and ultimately murder. A story that was solved not through finding a body or a crime scene, but through careful forensic work, linguistic analysis, and the painstaking assembly of circumstantial evidence. Jenny's body has never been found. Her killer has never confessed, but her memory lives on in the hearts of those who loved her, and in the hope that one day she'll finally be brought home. If this is your first time listening to one of our true crime stories, welcome to Mr. Sleepy Crime, where we explore these cases in a calm and respectful way. I also want to take a moment to appreciate my amazing subscribers who've been rocking with me. Thank you so much for your continued support. If you're still awake and listening, don't forget to drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and the current time in your corner of the world. Or just say something to let me know you're still here. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories for sleep. Now let's move on to our second story. Story 2. Tonight we're going to explore a case that shook the United Kingdom to its core in the summer of 2012. It's a story about trust broken in the most unimaginable way, about a young girl whose life was stolen by someone she believed would protect her. This is the story of Tia Sharp. The year was 2012, and London was alive with energy. The Olympic Games had come to the city, and everywhere you looked, there was excitement, celebration, and hope. People from all over the world had descended upon the British capital to witness history. The streets buzzed with activity. Screens displayed gold medal victories. And for a few magical weeks, the whole nation seemed united in joy. Against this backdrop of celebration, 12-year-old Tia Sharp was enjoying her summer holidays. Born on June 30th, 2000, Tia was a bright, energetic girl with her whole life ahead of her. She wore glasses that framed her young face, and those who knew her described her as sparky, full of life. Someone who lit up a room when she entered it. Tia lived with her mother, Natalie Sharp, in Mitcham, Surrey, along with Natalie's partner and Tia's two younger brothers. Natalie had been young when she had Tia, and over the years the relationship between mother and daughter had evolved into something deeper than the typical parent-child dynamic. They were close, more like friends in many ways, bound by a love that was visible to everyone who knew them. But Tia had another important person in her life, someone who was just as significant, just as present. That was her grandmother, Christine Bicknell. Christine lived in New Eddington, a neighborhood in South London, and Tia would often spend nights and weekends at her grandmother's house. The three of them, Natalie, Christine, and Tia, formed a tight-knit unit. They laughed together, confided in each other, and created memories that should have lasted a lifetime. Christine didn't live alone. She shared her home with her partner, a man named Stuart Hazel. Now, Stuart wasn't Tia's biological grandfather, but he'd been in her life since she was just 2 years old. For 10 years, he had been a constant presence, someone Tia had grown up with, someone she trusted implicitly. To Tia, Stuart Hazel was her granddad in every way that mattered. But Stuart Hazel was not the man he appeared to be. Stuart Hazel was 37 years old in the summer of 2012. To the outside world, to Tia's family, he seemed like an ordinary man. He had his flaws, certainly. He had a past that included a conviction for racially aggravated common assault and drug dealing. But people can change, can't they? Or at least that's what everyone wanted to believe. What no one knew, what no one could have possibly imagined, was what was happening inside Stuart Hazel's mind. Behind the facade of the caring grandfather figure, something dark had been growing. He had been viewing disturbing content on his mobile phone, searches that revealed a twisted obsession. His search history included terms that should never exist. Words like schoolgirl rape and incest. Some of his searches even included the word glasses. Tia wore glasses. He had been taking photos and videos of Tia without her knowledge. Voyeuristic footage of her applying moisturizer to her legs, of her sleeping in her bedroom. These were images of a child who trusted him completely. A child who had no idea that the man she called granddad was harboring such horrific intentions. But all of this remained hidden, a terrible secret that would only come to light after tragedy had already struck. On Thursday, August 2nd, 2012, the Olympics were in full swing. Tia had been texting with her grandmother and Stuart, asking if she could come stay the night with them. It was something she had done countless times before, a normal part of her life. Stuart texted Natalie back saying he didn't mind if Tia came over, but he added a detail that, in hindsight, would seem chilling. He mentioned that Christine wouldn't be there that evening. She would be working a night shift. Natalie read the message to Tia, asking her daughter if she still wanted to go, knowing Stuart would be the only one home initially. Without hesitation, Tia responded with enthusiasm. Yes, 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 yes. Years later, Natalie would torture herself with that moment. I wished I hadn't have read the text message, she would say. I wished I hadn't have read it out to her. I wished I'd told her no, she wasn't staying there. But how could she have known? How could anyone have known? That afternoon, as planned, Stuart met Tia when she got off the tram. CCTV footage would later capture them together at around 4:15 p.m., walking into a local co-op supermarket, buying food for the evening. To anyone watching, they looked like a grandfather and granddaughter, sharing a normal afternoon. There was nothing that would have raised alarm bells. Nothing that suggested the horror that was to come. Christine called that night from work to check in, asking if everything was all right. Stewart assured her that everything was fine. Tia was there. Everything was normal. But it wasn't. Sometime that night, or in the early hours of August 3rd, Stewart Hazel murdered Tia Sharp. The exact details of what happened remain partially unclear, as the cause of death was never definitively established due to the decomposition of her body. Investigators suspected she had been smothered, though this could never be proven beyond doubt. What the evidence did reveal was deeply disturbing. Forensic psychologist Carrie Nixon would later suggest that Hazel had made sexual advances toward Tia. When the 12-year-old girl, confused and frightened, rebuffed him, and likely threatened to tell her mother, Hazel silenced her forever. After killing her, Hazel did something that showed a calculated coldness. He took photographs of Tia's body, positioning her in ways that would gratify his twisted desires. These images, recovered later from memory cards hidden throughout the house, revealed the true depth of his depravity. Then he wrapped Tia's small body in a black bedsheet and placed her in black bin bags, taping them tightly to contain any smell. He carried her up into the loft of the house, pushing her to the side where she wouldn't be easily seen, and there, 12 feet above the home she had felt safe in, Tia Sharp's body would remain for the next week while her family desperately searched for her. When Christine Bicknell arrived home from her night shift on Friday morning, Tia wasn't there. This wasn't immediately concerning. Stewart told Christine a story that seemed perfectly plausible. Tia had woken up late, he said, and around midday she had left the house to catch a bus into Croydon. She wanted to go shopping at the Whitgift Center to buy new shoes. By 6 o'clock that evening, when Tia still hadn't returned, Christine began to feel the first stirrings of worry. It had been hours, even for a shopping trip. This seemed like a long time for a 12-year-old to be gone. Christine reached out to Natalie, asking if she had heard from Tia. She hadn't. Natalie tried calling Tia's phone, sending messages on Facebook, but there was no response. The worry that had been a small seed in Christine's mind began to grow into something larger, something more urgent. That evening, Natalie, Christine, and Stewart drove through the streets of New Addington, looking for any sign of Tia. They checked places she might go, asked people if they had seen her, but there was nothing. It was as if she had simply vanished. By 10 o'clock that night, they knew they needed help. They went to the police station and filed a missing person report. A 12-year-old girl, last seen leaving her grandmother's house to go shopping, now missing for hours. The police began their investigation immediately. Stewart Hazel, of course, was a person of interest. He had been the last person to see Tia before she supposedly left for Croydon. Police came to the house in New Addington to search for any clues about where Tia might have gone. They looked through her room, where they found her mobile phone. This was odd. Why would she leave her phone behind if she was going shopping? But perhaps she had simply forgotten it in her rush to get out. The police search of the house found nothing else of immediate concern. They didn't know that Tia's body was already there, hidden in the loft just above their heads. As Friday turned into Saturday, and Saturday into Sunday, the search for Tia Sharp intensified. Local residents of New Addington came together in a way that demonstrated the best of human nature. Hundreds of people printed posters and flyers with Tia's picture, distributing them throughout the neighborhood and beyond. They organized search parties, combing through local parks, woodland areas, and streets. Social media exploded with Tia's image. A Twitter campaign began, with people from across the United Kingdom sharing her photo and the details of her disappearance. Celebrities joined the cause using their platforms to spread awareness. The missing girl from New Addington had become a national story. On Sunday, August 5th, police released CCTV footage showing Tia at the co-op with Stewart on August 2nd. They appealed to the public, asking for anyone who had seen Tia to come forward. The Sun newspaper offered a reward for information leading to finding her. But as the days passed, something strange became apparent. Despite extensive CCTV coverage throughout the area, despite cameras at bus stops and shopping centers and train stations, there was not a single sighting of Tia Sharp after she had entered her grandmother's house on August 2nd. Not one camera had captured her leaving. For investigators, this was troubling. Stewart's story was that Tia had left around midday on August 3rd to catch a bus. But where was the footage? In a city covered with cameras, how could a 12-year-old girl in glasses simply disappear without a trace? Some people began to question Stewart's version of events. This made Stewart furious. He was insulted by the implication that he might be lying, that he might be involved in Tia's disappearance. To clear his name and to help find Tia, he contacted ITV, requesting an interview. On Thursday, August 9th, Stuart Hazel appeared on television, pleading for Tia's safe return. He stood there looking concerned, asking the public to help find the girl he had murdered and hidden in the loft of his own home just days earlier. It was a performance, one that would later be recognized as deeply disturbing. But there was something else that seemed to support Stewart's story, something that gave him credibility even as suspicions began to mount. A neighbor, Paul Meehan, had come forward with a statement. He told police that he had seen Tia leaving the house around midday on August 3rd. This corroborated Stewart's account and convinced investigators that Tia had indeed left the property. Based on this witness statement, police spent countless hours reviewing CCTV footage from areas away from the house, looking for any trace of where Tia might have gone. They were searching in the wrong places entirely, while Tia's body remained in the very house they had already searched. On Friday morning, August 10th, Stewart woke early. He told Christine he was going to the local shop to buy a newspaper. It was a casual statement, the kind of thing people say every day without a second thought. But Stuart Hazel knew something Christine didn't. He knew that time was running out. After Stewart left, Christine noticed something that sent a chill through her. There was a smell in the house, strong and unmistakable. She began searching for the source, checking the fridge, looking under furniture, even cleaning out the drains, but she couldn't find where it was coming from. A few hours later, the police arrived at the house. It was their fourth visit to the property. They told Christine they were going to conduct another search. When Christine mentioned the smell to the officers, their expressions changed. A bad feeling settled over the investigation team. This time they brought in the forensics team, along with sniffer dogs. The dog led them upstairs, toward the loft. An officer climbed up, pushing aside the clutter of items stored there, following the increasingly powerful odor. And then they found her, wrapped in a black bed sheet and sealed in black bin bags. Pushed to the side of the loft space was the body of Tia Sharp. She had been there for an entire week, decomposing in the August heat, just 12 feet above the family members, police officers and reporters who had been searching desperately for any sign of her. The missing persons investigation instantly became a murder inquiry. Stuart Hazel had left the house that morning to buy a newspaper. He never came back. When news broke that a body had been found in the house, police immediately launched a manhunt for Stuart Hazel. His photograph was distributed to media outlets across the country. Everyone was now looking for him, and everyone knew what he looked like. The public response was immediate. Tips began flooding in. Then at 8:25 that evening, police received a call that would end the manhunt. Someone had spotted Hazel at Cannon Hill Common in Morden. Officers rushed to the location and arrested Stuart Hazel on suspicion of murder. 2 other arrests followed. Christine Bicknell was arrested on suspicion of murder, and her neighbor, Paul Meehan, was arrested on suspicion of assisting an offender. Both would later be released on bail as the investigation continued. Commander Neil Basu, the officer in charge of the case, issued a public apology to Natalie Sharp. The police had failed to find Tia's body despite searching the house 3 times before. He attributed the failure to human error, explaining that an inexperienced officer had conducted the initial search and had not properly checked the loft space. The officer had looked briefly into the loft, but due to a lack of proper training and procedure, had not conducted a thorough search, because the house had been searched and nothing had been found. Investigators had shaped their strategy around the assumption that Tia had left the property. They had been looking in all the wrong places, while the answer had been there all along. For Natalie Sharp, this apology was devastating. Her daughter had been so close, just feet away, while they had all been searching desperately, believing she might still be alive somewhere. After Hazel's arrest, police conducted a comprehensive forensic examination of the house. What they discovered painted a horrifying picture of what had happened to Tia. Memory cards were recovered from various locations throughout the property. One was particularly well hidden, concealed in a doorframe on the ground floor. When investigators examined the contents of these cards, they found images and videos that had been deleted but were still recoverable. The footage showed Tia in sexual positions. Some of these images had been taken after her death. grotesque photographs that served Hazel's twisted desires. But there were also voyeuristic videos taken while Tia was still alive. Footage she had no idea was being recorded. Videos of her applying moisturizer to her legs, of her sleeping peacefully in her bedroom, completely unaware that the man she trusted was secretly filming her. Forensic psychologist Carrie Nixon would later suggest that Hazel had kept these images for sexual gratification, that his fantasies about Tia had been escalating over time until the night of August 2nd, when his voyeurism was no longer enough. One image, in particular, was crucial to understanding the timeline. The last photograph recovered showed Tia's body with blood pooling visible on her skin. Pathologists examining this image determined that, based on the pattern blood pooling, Tia was already dead when the photograph was taken. This helped establish that she had died on the night of August 2nd or in the early hours of August 3rd, not later as Hazel's story had suggested. Physical evidence also told a story. A vibrator was recovered from the home. When tested, it was found to contain Tia's blood and DNA, confirming that the murder had been sexually motivated. Stuart Hazel's search history on his mobile phone revealed a pattern of deeply disturbing interests. He had regularly searched for content involving incest, pedophilia, and rape. His fantasies, as Dr. Nixon noted, were crucial to understanding what had led to murder. On August 12, 2012, Stuart Hazel was formally charged with the murder of Tia Sharp. He appeared before Camberwell Green Magistrates Court via video link, where no plea was entered. The case was committed to the Old Bailey, London's Central Criminal Court, for trial. There were other legal proceedings as well. Paul Mason, the neighbor who had claimed to see Tia leaving the house on August 3rd, was charged with wasting police time. His false statement had led investigators away from the truth, causing them to spend countless hours reviewing CCTV footage and pursuing leads that went nowhere. In August 2013, he would be sentenced to 5 months in prison. The reason for his lie was never fully explained, but the impact had been significant. Christine Bicknell was released without charge. Further evidence made it clear that there had been only one perpetrator in this case, and that was Stuart Hazel. The trial was set for May 2013. As the date approached, Tia's family prepared themselves for the ordeal of sitting through testimony about what had happened to their beloved daughter and granddaughter. They would have to hear the evidence, see the photographs, relive the nightmare all over again. Stuart Hazel initially entered a plea of not guilty to murder. His defense would have required him to take the stand, to explain his version of events. He had told police that Tia's death was an accident, that she had fallen down the stairs. It was a lie. And it was a lie that he would have had to defend under cross-examination. But on the 5th day of the trial, something changed. Stuart Hazel's legal team approached the prosecution. Hazel wanted to change his plea. He pleaded guilty to murder. Years later, it would be understood why he made this decision. He couldn't face the cross-examination. He couldn't stand in court and tell his fabricated story while being questioned by skilled prosecutors who would tear it apart. He knew his story was dishonest, and he knew he couldn't maintain the lie under scrutiny. His guilty plea spared him the ordeal of trial, but it spared Tia's family nothing. The evidence still had to be presented to the jury. Natalie Sharp still had to sit in that courtroom and learn the full extent of what had been done to her daughter. She still had to see the photograph of Tia that Hazel had taken, the one that showed her naked body. Your plea of guilty has spared the family none of that, Justice Nichol would later tell Hazel during sentencing. On May 14, 2013, Stuart Hazel was brought back into Court 2 at the Old Bailey for sentencing. The courtroom was packed. Tia's mother, Natalie Sharp, was there, along with her grandmother Christine Bicknell and her father Stephen Carter. Police officers in the public gallery had tissues ready, knowing the emotional weight of what was about to happen. Justice Nichol addressed Stuart Hazel directly. "She was a sparky girl who was full of life," the judge said. "But you took that life from her." He spoke about everything Tia would never experience. A career, falling in love, having a family of her own. All of it was gone, because of Hazel's actions. The judge acknowledged certain factors he had considered when determining the sentence. Hazel had had an unhappy childhood, with a mother who had been a prostitute and a father in prison, leading to Hazel going into care at a young age. The murder, the judge noted, had not been premeditated, and Hazel had eventually entered a guilty plea, though it had come far too late to earn much credit. "It may be the first act of remorse," Justice Nichols said. But because it comes so late, I am afraid it will earn you only the most modest of credit. He also addressed the profound impact of the crime. The tragedy of their loss and her death is because of your act in murdering Tia Sharp. You are responsible. Then Justice Nickel told Stuart Hesel to stand. The sentence was life imprisonment, with a minimum term of 38 years before Hesel would even be eligible to be considered for parole. There were shouts from the public gallery. "Yes," some called out, "beast." Another man yelled at Hesel. Others sobbed, overcome with emotion. And Natalie Sharp maintained her composure, though the pain was evident on her face. Stephen Carter put his head in his hands. Outside the court afterward, a reporter asked Stephen Carter what he thought of the sentence. "It's no justice for Tia," he said, his voice heavy with grief. "Justice would be if she were still alive." Stuart Hesel was 37 years old at sentencing. He would serve a minimum of 38 years, meaning he would be 75 before even being considered for release. And because he received a life sentence, there was no guarantee he would ever be freed. That decision would rest with the parole board, who would have to determine whether he was safe to return to society. Many believe he never will be. On September 14, 2012, Tia Sharp was laid to rest. A private family funeral was held, followed by cremation. Those who loved her gathered to say goodbye to the bright, sparky girl who had brought so much joy into their lives. The case had lasting impacts beyond Tia's family. In November 2013, partly in response to Tia's murder and the murder of another young girl named April Jones, major search engines, including Google and Microsoft, modified their systems. They implemented measures to make it harder to find child abuse images online. The tragedy of Tia Sharp had been cited repeatedly in the campaign to force this change. In June 2013, Croydon Council began the demolition of the house where Tia's body had been found. The building at the Lindens in New Addington was torn down, and work eventually began on new houses to be built on the site. The physical structure where such horror had occurred was erased, though the memory would never fade. The Metropolitan Police conducted a review of what had gone wrong in the investigation. How had 3 searches of the house failed to find Tia's body? The answer came down to training, procedure, and human error. Changes were implemented to ensure that such a failure would not happen again. For Natalie Sharp, there would be no moving on. Not really. In interviews, she spoke about the guilt she carried, the endless what-ifs that haunted her. What if she hadn't read that text message to Tia? What if she had said no? What if she had trusted her instincts and not let Tia go? But how could she have known? How could anyone have known that the man they all trusted, the man who had been part of their family for 10 years, was capable of such evil? There were also troubling questions about whether warning signs had been missed. Social services had been involved with Tia's family at various points. They had found her home life to be somewhat chaotic, but there had been no signs of abuse. A report was supposed to have been given to Tia's school, asking teachers to keep an eye on her, but it was never delivered. Whether this would have made any difference is impossible to know. Stuart Hesel had hidden his dark obsession well until the night he acted on it. Tonight, as we come to the end of this story, it's important that we remember Tia Sharp not for how she died, but for how she lived. She was 12 years old, on the cusp of becoming a teenager, full of potential and dreams. She loved spending time with her family, especially her mother and grandmother. She wore glasses that framed her face and gave her a distinctive look. Those who knew her said she was sparky, a word that captures a certain brightness, a certain energy that drew people to her. She should have gone shopping that day in Croydon. She should have bought the shoes she wanted. She should have come home and told her grandmother about her day. She should have grown up, gone to secondary school, discovered who she wanted to be, fallen in love, perhaps had children of her own one day. All of that was taken from her by someone she trusted completely. The murder of Tia Sharp reminds us of a painful truth, that sometimes the people we trust most are the ones who hurt us. That evil can hide behind a familiar face, behind someone who seems safe, someone who has been part of our lives for years. For Natalie Sharp, for Christine Bicknell, for Tia's father Stephen Carter, and her brothers, the pain will never fully go away. They carry it with them every day, the loss of a daughter, a granddaughter, a sister who should still be here. And somewhere in a prison cell, Stuart Hesel serves his sentence, knowing that he destroyed not just Tia's life, but the lives of everyone who loved her. Please, if you're still awake, drop a candle. I want to see who's still with me. Also, don't forget to tell me where you're listening from, the time in your corner of the world, and maybe share one thing you've learned from tonight's stories. Meanwhile, let's move on to our third story. Story 3. Tonight, we'll explore a story that unfolded in the desert heat of Las Vegas, Nevada. This is the story of Daniel Halseth, a devoted father whose love for his daughter would ultimately lead to his tragic end. It's a tale of broken families, forbidden love, and choices that can never be undone. Daniel Halseth's story begins like many American dreams. He was born into a close-knit family, growing up to become a talented IT professional with a passion for music, photography, and the outdoors. Those who knew him described him as gentle, artistic, and deeply devoted to those he loved. In 2001, Daniel's life took a romantic turn when he met Elizabeth Schwarach, a high school senior in Salem, Oregon. Despite the age difference in her youth, they fell quickly in love. Elizabeth graduated, and soon after they married, ready to build their future together. The couple welcomed 3 children in quick succession: a daughter in 2002, a son in 2003, and their youngest daughter, Sierra, in 2004. For a time, life seemed full of possibility. Daniel worked in IT while Elizabeth cared for their growing family. In 2006, they moved to Nevada, seeking new opportunities in the sun-drenched valley of Las Vegas. By 2010, Elizabeth had set her sights beyond domestic life. She entered the political arena, running for the Nevada State Senate. In a surprising upset, she won, becoming the youngest woman ever elected to the Nevada legislature at just 27 years old. It was a Cinderella story that captured local attention. But political success came with sacrifice. During legislative sessions, Elizabeth spent long stretches in Carson City, the state capital, more than 7 hours from their Las Vegas home. Daniel became a stay-at-home father, managing the household and caring for their 3 young children during her absences. The distance between them grew into something more than miles. The marriage that had begun with such promise began to fracture under the weight of ambition, absence, and changing priorities. Marriage counseling couldn't bridge the widening gulf between them. In October 2011, everything came crashing down. Police responded to a domestic incident at the Halseth home. Elizabeth had told her mother that Daniel had become controlling, taking her phone, purse, and car keys. The details were murky, painful, and ultimately led to criminal charges against Daniel for battery and lewdness, though the incident seemed to involve an argument rather than violence. Shortly after, Daniel filed for divorce. The end of their marriage played out publicly and messily. Elizabeth resigned from the state senate in February 2012, citing the need to focus on being a single mother and finding employment. But rumors swirled about an affair she had allegedly been conducting in Carson City with a man named Tiger Helgilian, a former golf pro and realtor, whose website Daniel had ironically been helping to build. The divorce was finalized in 2012. Elizabeth was granted primary custody of their 3 children. Daniel moved into a nearby apartment, determined to remain a constant presence in his children's lives. Despite the bitter end to their marriage, he worked hard to make visitation special, to show his kids that his love for them never wavered. In 2012, Elizabeth delivered another blow. She was taking the children to Alaska. For Daniel, it was devastating. His 3 children, his reason for everything, would be thousands of miles away in Anchorage. He could only watch from afar as they grew up, relying on phone calls, video chats, and occasional visits. The years in Alaska were difficult for everyone. The children struggled with the distance from their father and the disruption to their lives. For Sierra, the youngest, it seemed particularly hard. She was just 8 years old when they moved, old enough to feel the loss but too young to understand why her family had fallen apart. During this time, Elizabeth remarried, becoming Elizabeth Helgilian. Daniel, meanwhile, remained in Las Vegas, working and waiting for chances to see his children. The legal battles over custody continued, with both parents making accusations about the other's fitness as a parent. By 2020, Sierra was 16 and deeply unhappy. She reached out to her father, pleading with him to help her. She claimed she was experiencing abuse in her mother's home, both physical and emotional. Whether these claims were true would later become a point of bitter contention. But Daniel believed his daughter and sprang into action. He filed motions in family court to gain custody of Sierra. In videos from those court hearings, the battle was clearly acrimonious. Elizabeth insisted Daniel was creating a toxic environment and speaking negatively about her to Sierra. Daniel argued that Sierra was being mistreated in Alaska and needed to be with him. The family court judge Charles Hoskin noted during hearings that something was clearly wrong with Sierra. Child Protective Services became involved. Interviewing the teenager, in August 2020, the judge ordered Daniel to return Sierra to her mother's custody, finding he had violated their custody agreement. But Sierra didn't stay in Alaska. She kept returning to her father's home in Las Vegas, a 4-bedroom house he rented near Durango, and Alta Drive in the northwest part of the valley. Daniel told the court he was protecting his daughter, that she was safer with him. Elizabeth accused him of not making sincere efforts to return Sierra, suggesting he was gaming the system. The truth, as is often the case in custody battles, probably lay somewhere in the complicated middle. What is clear is that Sierra, caught between warring parents, was struggling, and into that volatile situation walked a young man named Aaron Guerrero. Aaron Guerrero was 18 years old when he began dating Sierra in the summer of 2020. He came from his own troubled background, dealing with mental health issues that he wasn't consistently medicating. Later, he would claim he had been using LSD, ordering it from websites and taking it recreationally. For Sierra and Aaron, it was intense young love, the kind that feels like destiny when you're 15 and 18. They dated from June through December 2020, spending time together whenever they could, sharing dreams of a future together. They even talked about running away to Los Angeles, starting fresh where no one could tell them what to do. But their parents saw red flags. An 18-year-old dating a 15-year-old was concerning enough. But the intensity of their relationship and their talk of running away alarmed both families. In December 2020, after discovering their plans to flee to Los Angeles, the parents intervened. Daniel forbade Sierra from seeing Aaron anymore. Aaron's parents agreed. The relationship had to end. For most teenage romances, that would have been the end of it. Hurt feelings, some dramatic texts, perhaps some sneaking around, but eventually moving on. But for Sierra and Aaron, the prohibition became something else. A shared grievance, a mutual enemy, a problem that demanded a solution. April 8, 2021 was a Thursday, spring in Las Vegas, with warm days and cool evenings. Aaron Guerrero ran away from his home that morning. He met up with Sierra, and together they went shopping. They didn't go to the mall or buy movies or video games. Instead, they went to a Home Depot near Daniel's house. Surveillance cameras captured them moving through the aisles, selecting items with deliberate care. A circular saw blades, disposable gloves, drop cloths. Then they stopped at other stores. Bleach, lighter fluid, more cleaning supplies. Throughout the day, Sierra's grandmother, Daniel's mother, was trying to reach her son. She sent text after text to Sierra's phone. "Is your dad there? Can I talk to him?" Sierra stalled, making excuses. "Dad's in the shower, his phone isn't working, he's busy." Just normal things that wouldn't raise too much alarm. That evening, Sierra and Aaron returned to Daniel's house with their purchases. What happened next would be the subject of court testimony, police reports, and their own chilling admissions. The details of Daniel Halseth's death are difficult to recount. He died in his own home, in a place that should have been safe, at the hands of people he should have been able to trust. According to Aaron Guerrero's later statements, both he and Sierra were armed. Sierra got a weapon first. Aaron said he always carried a weapon. They both agreed they had to do something about Daniel's prohibition on their relationship. Daniel was attacked with shocking brutality. The autopsy would reveal approximately 70 sharp force injuries to his body. 42 of these wounds were on the back of his head, neck, and torso. His lungs were punctured. A major artery in his neck was severed. There were wounds on his shoulders, thighs, wrists, fingers, forearms, and hands. Some of the wounds formed what the medical examiner described as a ladder-like pattern on his forearm. Defensive wounds, showing that Daniel had tried to protect himself, tried to fight off his attackers. Some wounds were inflicted after death, deep and purposeful. One appeared to be from assault. The attack was frenzied, personal, and devastating. When it was over, Daniel Halseth, 45 years old, lay dead in his home. His daughter and her boyfriend stood in the aftermath of what they'd done, surrounded by blood and silence. In the hours after the murder, Sierra and Aaron tried to erase what they'd done. They attempted to dismember Daniel's body using the saw they'd purchased. When that proved too difficult, they stuffed his body into a sleeping bag. They set fires in multiple locations throughout the house. The garage, the living room, the backyard, trying to destroy the evidence. Approximately 40% of Daniel's body was burned. The house filled with smoke, but the fires didn't spread as they'd hoped. Pocket knives were left in the kitchen sink. The chainsaw, still bloody, sat in the living room. Home Depot receipts and ATM slips were scattered throughout the house, a paper trail leading directly back to them. Then Sierra and Aaron took Daniel's debit cards and 2016 Nissan Altima. They drove to ATMs, withdrawing cash. The surveillance cameras captured Sierra using her father's cards, standing at machines while Aaron waited in the car. They drove northeast, out of Nevada, heading toward Utah. They were going to Salt Lake City, and from there, who knows? Maybe they still dreamed of Los Angeles. Maybe they thought they could disappear into new identities, leave Daniel's death behind them and start fresh. But before they fled, they did something almost incomprehensible. They recorded a video, lying together somewhere, perhaps in Daniel's car as they drove through the dark desert. Sierra and Aaron turned on a phone camera and recorded themselves. They were close together, faces near each other, and they were smiling. "Welcome back to our YouTube channel," Aaron said to the camera, his voice casual, almost playful. Day 3 after murdering somebody. Sierra, lying beside him, reacted with surprise. "Whoa," she said. "Don't put that on camera." But they left it recording. They seemed to giggle together, making light comments. Aaron later explained they were both trying to cope with what they'd done, trying to deal with the reality of it. He insisted he felt remorse every day. At the time, though, on that video, there's laughter. There's an attempt at humor about taking a life, about killing Sierra's own father. The video would become one of the most damning pieces of evidence against them. More than the receipts, more than the surveillance footage. This video showed something the prosecution would argue demonstrated a complete lack of remorse. This video would haunt them through their trial and sentencing. On Friday, April 9, Daniel's mother grew increasingly worried. Her texts to Sierra had gone unanswered. Her calls to Daniel's phone went to voicemail. Something felt wrong. She asked a friend, Peggy Newman, who was also Daniel's landlord, to check on him. Peggy drove to the house on Dunphy Court with a companion. When they arrived, the front door was unlocked, standing open. They stepped inside and immediately smelled smoke. There were scorch marks on the living room floor. The house was quiet, eerily so. "Daniel," Peggy called out. No answer. They moved through the house, following the smell of smoke toward the garage. That's where they found him. Daniel's body, burned and wrapped in a sleeping bag, lay near the garage door. Even from a distance, it was clear something horrific had happened. Peggy and her friend immediately left the house and called 911. Firefighters and police arrived quickly. When they extinguished the remaining fire and examined the body, they could see this was no accidental death. The sharp force injuries were obvious, even through the burns. This was murder. Brutal and premeditated. The investigation began immediately. Who would want Daniel Helseth dead? The answer, tragically, was closer than anyone wanted to believe. Detectives processed the scene methodically. The blood-soaked power tools, the receipts scattered throughout the house, the pocket knives in the sink. Every piece told a story of violence and attempted cover-up. They reviewed surveillance footage from the stores where the tools and supplies had been purchased. There, clear as day, was Aaron Guerrero, selecting items, paying for them, and there was Sierra, using her father's debit cards at ATMs after his death. They found Sierra's phone and extracted the video. The laughing, the casual references to murder, the callousness of it. They learned about the custody battle, the forbidden relationship, the threats to run away. They traced the couple's movements after the murder, following the trail of debit card transactions northeast toward Utah. 4 days after Daniel's body was discovered, on April 13, 2021, police in Salt Lake City detained Sierra Helseth and Aaron Guerrero. They were found at a transit station, apparently having just purchased tickets. They had been planning to go somewhere, to keep running, but their journey ended there, in handcuffs. facing the long trip back to Las Vegas to answer for what they'd done. Because Sierra was 16 years old at the time of the murder, Nevada law automatically charged her as an adult. Aaron, already 18, faced adult charges from the start. Prosecutors made it clear they would seek the death penalty against Aaron. Though Sierra's age spared her from that possibility, both were charged with murder with a deadly weapon, conspiracy to commit murder, first-degree arson, robbery with a deadly weapon, conspiracy to commit robbery, 4 counts of fraudulent use of a credit or debit card. They were held without bail at the Clark County Detention Center. Their arraignment was conducted virtually, both appearing on screens. Their young faces somber as the charges were read. Initially, both pleaded not guilty. Their attorneys began building their cases, though the evidence against them seemed overwhelming. The video alone would be nearly impossible to explain away. As the case developed, questions swirled about motive. Why? Why would a 16-year-old girl murder her father? Why would an 18-year-old boy participate in such violence? Sierra's attorney, Michael Santh, suggested there was more to the story than what appeared in media reports. He hinted at abuse, at a complicated family history that might provide context if not justification. He noted the bitter custody battle, the allegations Sierra had made about her father. Daniel's family vehemently denied any abuse. They described Daniel as a loving, gentle father who had devoted his life to his children. They pointed to the custody dispute as evidence that Daniel was fighting for his daughter, not harming her. The truth, whatever it was, died with Daniel. For more than a year, the case wound through the legal system. Both defendants sat in jail, contemplating trials that would expose every detail of that terrible night. Trials that would feature the video, the autopsy photos, the crime scene images. In May 2022, Sierra Halseth and Aaron Guerrero both made the same decision. They would accept plea deals. On May 25, 2022, in the Regional Justice Center in Las Vegas, both teens stood before District Judge Tiara Jones and admitted their guilt. They pleaded guilty to all charges: murder, conspiracy, arson, robbery, fraud. Judge Jones asked Sierra directly if she understood what she was pleading guilty to. You either directly committed this offense, you aided and abetted in the commission of this offense, or you conspired to commit this offense. Is that what you did? Sierra confirmed it was. The plea deal specified that both would receive sentences of 22 years to life in prison, with the possibility of parole after 22 years. The prosecution agreed not to seek the death penalty against Aaron in exchange for the guilty pleas. The courtroom was full of Daniel's family members, his mother, his siblings, cousins, all there to see justice for a man they loved. For them, no sentence would be enough. But at least there would be no trial. No need to hear every horrible detail in open court. Sentencing was scheduled for October 20, 2022. The courtroom was again packed with Daniel's family, many wearing shirts with his picture, carrying poster boards covered with photographs of the man they'd lost. Daniel's siblings addressed the court. His brother Thomas spoke through tears about losing his best friend. His sister Leslie described the hole Daniel's death had left in their family. They set up display boards showing Daniel smiling with his children, playing music, enjoying the outdoors, a man full of life. Not the victim found burned in a garage. When it was the defendant's turn to speak, the contrast was striking. Aaron Guerrero offered an apology. He told Daniel's family he was sorry, that he felt remorse every day. He tried to explain his mental state at the time, the medications he wasn't taking, the substances he was using. He insisted he wasn't a monster, but Sierra Halseth offered no apology. She stood with her attorney and read a prepared statement that focused on her own trauma and experiences. She didn't express remorse for taking her father's life. This silence, this refusal to apologize, cut Daniel's family deeply. Judge Tiara Jones addressed both defendants before pronouncing sentence. "This is a very, very tragic situation," she said. "I wish that there was something that I was going to say or something that I could do that would stop all the suffering that is going on. But there wasn't." She sentenced both Sierra Halseth and Aaron Guerrero to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 22 years. They were also ordered to pay $5,000 in restitution, though no amount of money could compensate for a life taken. Sierra, who had just turned 18, was transferred to the Florence McClure Women's Correctional Center in North Las Vegas. Aaron, then 20, went to the High Desert State Prison, a maximum security facility. They will be eligible for parole in 2043, when Sierra is 38 and Aaron is 40. Whether they will be granted it is another question entirely. In the months after sentencing, Aaron Guerrero gave an interview from prison. He spoke with a local news investigator, trying to explain what had happened that April night. "She got the weapon first," he said, "and I always carry a weapon, so you know that's what led to what happened after that." When asked whose idea was to commit murder, he said, "It was both of our ideas because we didn't know exactly what we were going to do, but we knew we had to do something about it, and it turned out terribly wrong." He claimed that he and Sierra believed Daniel was abusive, and that they felt they had no other choice. He insisted he felt remorse every day. He said he'd been acting on impulse rather than love, despite their relationship. Aaron also revealed that he planned to have no contact with Sierra going forward. The relationship that had seemed so important, so worth fighting for, had dissolved in the reality of prison life and the weight of what they'd done. Sierra has not spoken publicly since her sentencing. She remains incarcerated, her teenage years passing behind bars. The daughter who killed her father. For Daniel's family, the sentencing brought no closure. His mother, Christine Halseth, has spoken about the unbearable grief of losing her son in such a violent way. She described Daniel as a loving father, an incredible musician, a talented photographer, and an avid outdoorsman. "He should have turned 48 in January," she wrote in 2023. The ache of his absence still raw. The family released a statement after the charges were filed that read, "Daniel Halseth was first and foremost a loving father, brother, and son, who was the heart of the Halseth family. To have him taken from us in such a horrific, savage, senseless, and violent act of murder leaves us heartbroken, and our grief is unyielding." The total lack of remorse on display in the video is both reprehensible and unforgivable. In the years since Daniel's death, his ex-wife Elizabeth has continued her political career, running for various offices including Congress. This has brought renewed attention to the case, with Daniel's family speaking out against what they see as Elizabeth's attempts to rewrite history and portray herself as blameless in the family's dysfunction. The custody battle that raged before Daniel's death has become a source of ongoing dispute, with each side blaming the other for creating the circumstances that led to tragedy. Daniel's family insists he was a devoted father trying to protect his daughter. Elizabeth and her supporters suggest Sierra was acting out of fear and desperation. The truth, as always, is probably more complicated than either narrative allows. What remains undeniable is that a man is dead, killed by his own child, and that multiple families have been shattered by violence that never should have happened. The murder of Daniel Halseth forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about families, about love and control, about the line between protection and possession. Was Daniel a devoted father trying to save his daughter from a bad situation? Was he a controlling parent using custody laws to win against his ex-wife? The evidence suggests he loved his children deeply and tried to be present in their lives despite tremendous obstacles. Was Sierra an abused child who saw no way out? Was she a manipulative teenager who killed her father because he stood in the way of what she wanted? The evidence shows a troubled young woman caught between warring parents who made a terrible choice that can never be undone. Was Aaron a troubled young man manipulated by his girlfriend? Was he an equally culpable killer who participated willingly in brutal violence? The evidence indicates he was dealing with mental health issues and substance use, but that he knew right from wrong. These questions have no simple answers. What we know is that on April 8, 2021, two teenagers made a choice. They chose violence. They chose murder. They chose to take a life. And Daniel Halseth, who spent his final years fighting for his children, who moved across states to be near them, who believed he was protecting his daughter, died in his own home, betrayed by the child he loved most. The house on Dunphy Court in Las Vegas stands as a reminder of that terrible night. The scorch marks have been cleaned. The blood has been washed away, but the memory of what happened there remains. Sierra Halseth will be middle-aged before she has a chance at freedom. Aaron Guerrero will be 40. They will have spent their entire young adulthoods behind bars, paying for choices made when they were barely more than children themselves. Daniel's other two children, his older daughter and son, have lost their father and their sister. They must somehow make sense of a family destroyed by violence from within. And every April 9th, Daniel's family remembers the day they found out he was gone, taken from them in the most brutal way possible. This is the story of Daniel Halseth, a father, a brother, a son, a man who loved his children and tried to protect them, whose life ended in tragedy and whose memory remains with those who loved him. May he rest in peace, and may those left behind find some measure of healing in time. Please, I'm just putting it out there. If you're still awake and listening, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from, the time in your part of the world, or just say something to let me know you're still with me. And of course, if you haven't already, like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story for sleep. Now, let's move on to our fourth story. Story 4. In the summer of 2012, Staten Island was quieter than usual. The 4th of July had just passed, leaving behind the lingering smell of fireworks and the echo of celebration. For most people, it was a time of rest, of watching the lazy days drift by. But for one family, the tranquility was about to shatter into a nightmare that would expose secrets hidden behind a facade of normalcy. This is the story of Simeonette Mapes Krupe, a woman whose life was defined by compassion, dedication, and an unwavering belief in the goodness of people. It's also the story of how that belief would ultimately lead to her tragic end. Simeonette Mapes was born on September 25, 1982, in Albuquerque, New Mexico. From her very first breath, movement seemed to be woven into the fabric of her life. Her father, John Mapes Jr., served in the United States Air Force, and like many military families, the Mapes household never stayed in one place for long. The family moved frequently, New Mexico to Staten Island, then to the Fort Hamilton Army Base in Brooklyn, a brief stint in Florida, and back to Brooklyn again. By the time young Simeonette, whom everyone called Sissy, was 6 years old in 1988, she had already lived in more places than most people visit in a lifetime. But despite the constant upheaval, Sissy developed into a remarkable young woman. She had an infectious laugh that could light up a room. She loved to dance, moving with the kind of freedom that suggested she'd never met a worry she couldn't shake off. Her parents, John and Teresa, watched their daughter bloom with pride, recognizing in her something special, a genuine kindness that seemed almost out of place in the world. Sissy graduated from Fort Hamilton High School with honors. It was there, working with children who had special needs, that she discovered her calling. She would become a teacher. Not just any teacher, but the kind who genuinely cared about every single student who walked through her classroom door. She enrolled at the College of Staten Island in Willowbrook, pursuing both her bachelor's and master's degrees in education. The campus became her second home, and it was there, among the lecture halls and study groups, that Sissy met someone who seemed to share her passion for teaching. His name was Jonathan Krupe. Jonathan was also studying to become a teacher. On the surface, he and Sissy seemed perfectly matched. Two young people with similar dreams, both wanting to shape young minds and make a difference in the world. They were playful with each other, finishing each other's sentences, laughing at inside jokes that no one else understood. Friends who knew them during their college years described them as inseparable. There was an ease between them, a comfort that suggested they'd found something real. And perhaps in the beginning, they... In July 2007, Simeonette Mapes and Jonathan Krupe were married. They moved into their own place, ready to build a life together. For Sissy, everything seemed to be falling into place. She had landed a position with the New York City Department of Education in 2006, teaching social studies. By 2009, she had found her home at the School for Classics, an academy of thinkers, writers, and performers in Brooklyn. The School for Classics wasn't in an easy neighborhood. Located directly across from the Cypress Hills housing projects in East New York, it was the kind of place where teachers needed to be more than just educators. They needed to be mentors, protectors, and sometimes mediators in a world that could turn violent without warning. But Sissy thrived there. Her students adored her. She ran the girls' leadership club and founded something she called the Fairy Godmothers Project, a program that provided prom dresses to students who couldn't afford them. When she discovered that 15 students couldn't buy caps and gowns for graduation, she quietly made sure they had them. She never sought recognition for any of it. That wasn't who she was. She wasn't looking for recognition, her brother John Mapes III would later say. And that's the epitome of what a good person should be. While Sissy's career flourished, Jonathan's path was rockier. He failed his teaching exam on the first attempt. The failure must have stung. But Sissy stood by him. She helped him study. She encouraged him, and when he needed to pay $25,000 out of pocket to retake the exam, they found a way to make it work. Finally, Jonathan passed. He became an English teacher, and Sissy was so proud of him that she begged the school for classics to hire him. The administration agreed, and soon the couple were working at the same school, sharing the same commute, the same challenges, the same victory. To anyone watching from the outside, they had built something beautiful, but cracks were already forming in the foundation, invisible but deep. On June 28th, 2012, just a week before the 4th of July, Sissy posted something on her Facebook page that would later seem almost prophetic. "Krupi and I survived a shootout today," she wrote. "Thank God we are okay. I'm sure over summer school we'll find out what the fighting was about. The Cypress Hill projects are no joke." When concerned friends responded with alarm, she was quick to reassure them. "Krupi and I are fine. No worries. I didn't mean to scare anyone. It's just a hazard of working in East NY, Brooklyn. Just a hazard." Those words captured everything about who Sissy was, someone who accepted danger as part of her commitment to her students, who faced down violence with the same calm determination that made her such an effective teacher. A friend commented on the post, "Only two incredible people and badass teachers could view something like this as just a hazard of working in East NY." But Sissy had survived gang violence in one of Brooklyn's toughest neighborhoods. She had stood her ground and returned the next day to keep teaching. The irony, the cruel, senseless irony, was that the real danger wasn't waiting for her in Brooklyn. It was waiting for her at home. The 4th of July, 2012, fell on a Wednesday. The couple attended a party celebrating with friends and family, but something was wrong. Those who were there noticed that Sissy seemed subdued, not her usual vibrant self. At some point during the evening, she and Jonathan left early. When asked why, Sissy said she wasn't feeling well, but it wasn't the flu or a headache that was bothering her. It was something she had discovered about her husband. By early July, Sissy had begun to piece together the truth about Jonathan's double life. She had found a phone number saved in his contacts under the name Woman. When she searched for it, the number belonged to someone who went by the alias Miss Pumpkin, a sex worker who Jonathan had been seeing regularly for 2 years. But that wasn't all. Sissy had also discovered that Jonathan hadn't been attending the master's degree classes she'd been paying for, the classes that were supposed to advance his career, the classes that would help him become a better teacher. He'd been skipping them. Instead, he'd been spending time at a strip club located right next to their school. The woman who had begged the school to hire him, who had supported him through his failures, who had paid for his education, that woman had been lied to repeatedly and deliberately. According to Sissy's mother, Teresa, her daughter confronted Jonathan about these discoveries around July 2nd. What was said during that conversation, no one knows for certain, but the marriage that had looked so solid from the outside was crumbling. On July 4th, after they left the party, Sissy and Jonathan returned to their home in the New Springville neighborhood of Staten Island. The condo they shared had been their haven, their place of safety, but that night it became something else entirely. What happened in the early morning hours of July 5th, 2012, would transform their home into a crime scene. July 5th, 2012, a Thursday afternoon. The heat of summer hung heavy over Staten Island. At 2:30 in the afternoon, a frantic 911 call came in. "I just came home," a man's voice said, breathless and panicked. "My wife is dead. Oh my God. I think my house was robbed." The caller was Jonathan Krupi. Police rushed to the address in New Springville. What they found when they arrived would haunt even the most seasoned detectives. Simeonette Maps Krupi, 29 years old, lay dead at the bottom of a flight of stairs. She had been pushed down those stairs, and then she had been stabbed 15 times. Her body was face down in a pool of blood, in the entry foyer of her own home. Detective Michael Cosenza of the New York City Police Department's Homicide Squad was one of the first investigators on the scene. It was violent, he would later say. It was a violent death. The home had been ransacked. Furniture was overturned, drawers pulled open, belongings scattered across the floor. At first glance, it looked like a home invasion, a burglary gone terribly wrong, but something didn't feel right. It was completely trashed, Cosenza said. To me, it looked staged. The detectives began to notice details that didn't add up. Credit cards were still there, Blank checks sat in plain view. Sissy's engagement ring, a valuable piece of jewelry that any thief would have grabbed, was untouched. If this had been a robbery, why had the burglar left behind so many valuable items? And there was something else. The detectives found no sign of forced entry at the front door, but there was a sliding glass door at the back of the home, and it was slightly ajar. The handle of that door was carefully processed for DNA evidence. What they would eventually find there would change the entire direction of the investigation. Jonathan Krupe appeared to be devastated. Neighbors saw him outside the home, crying and repeating, "She's dead. I came home. It was hot. She was dead. She's dead." When Sissy's parents, John and Teresa Mapes, arrived at the scene, they were desperate for answers. John pressed Jonathan for any information, any clue about who could have done this terrible thing. "John, I want you to think," John Mapes said to his son-in-law. "Who could do this?" Jonathan's response was cold, almost dismissive. "We need to get beyond this," he said. John Mapes would remember that moment for the rest of his life. His daughter had just been brutally murdered, and Jonathan wanted to get beyond it. But publicly, Jonathan played his part. At Sissy's funeral, hundreds of people came to pay their respects. The beloved teacher had touched so many lives. Jonathan stood at the front, weeping, and at one point, he laid 2 roses on her coffin. A gesture that seemed heartbreaking at the time, but would later feel like the worst kind of performance. Meanwhile, the detectives were building their case. Assistant District Attorney Wanda de Oliveira was brought in to work with the homicide detectives. In domestic situations, she knew, the spouse is always the first person investigators look at. It's not bias, it's statistics. Most people are killed by someone they know, and husbands and wives have intimate access to each other in ways that make them both vulnerable and dangerous. Jonathan gave police a detailed account of his movements on July 5th. He said he'd left home around 7:30 in the morning to run errands. He'd gone to pick up school supplies that Sissy needed for summer school. He'd also visited a Home Depot to look at rugs, and he'd even sent Sissy a text message asking for her opinion on one. She never responded. He said he returned home around 2 p.m. and immediately called 911 when he discovered her body. Detectives began checking his story. Surveillance cameras confirmed that he had indeed gone to work that morning. A receipt verified his car inspection at a local shop. So far, his alibi seemed to hold. But then came the DNA results from the sliding glass door. The DNA belonged to 2 people. One was Jonathan Krupe, the other was a female. But it wasn't Simeonette. Who was this mystery woman? And what was her connection to the crime? On July 11th, 6 days after the murder, detectives began digging deeper into Jonathan's story about picking up school supplies. They spoke with the principal of the school for classics, and what they learned was damning. The principal told them that all the necessary materials for summer school had already been moved to another location. There was no reason for Jonathan to come to the school that morning. His entire reason for being there was a lie. Security footage from the school showed Jonathan entering a computer room. What was he doing there? Detectives obtained search warrants for both Jonathan's and Sissy's school-issued laptops. What they found on those computers told 2 very different stories. Jonathan's search history included queries about reselling sneakers and hip-hop music. Normal enough. But there were other searches, ones that made the investigators' blood run cold. How to throat slash. How to clean up a crime scene. What destroys DNA? These weren't recent searches. They'd been conducted months before Sissy's death. Jonathan had been planning something, preparing for something. The evidence suggested premeditation. Sissy's laptop told a heartbreaking story of its own. Her search history included terms like in vitro fertilization and marriage counselors. She'd been trying to save her marriage, trying to build a future even as she discovered the depth of Jonathan's betrayal. And there was one more search that stood out. Sissy had looked up a phone number. The number saved in Jonathan's phone as woman. That number belonged to Miss Pumpkin. Miss Pumpkin was a sex worker who operated in the New York area. When detectives tracked her down, she was cooperative and direct. She knew Jonathan, she said, but not by that name. To her, he was Mike. They had been meeting for sexual encounters for the past 2 years, she explained. Usually Jonathan would contact her a day or 2 in advance to arrange their meetings. It had become a routine, but on July 5th, something had been different. That morning, Jonathan, or Mike as she knew him, had called her unexpectedly. He wanted to meet right away, urgently. This wasn't their usual pattern, but she agreed. They met at 12:45. That was the exact same time Jonathan had told police he was at Home Depot looking at rugs. During their encounter, Jonathan had asked Miss Pumpkin a strange question. He'd asked if she had heard anything about a man killing his wife. At the time, the question had seemed odd, but not necessarily suspicious. New York is a big city, and crime makes the news constantly, but in retrospect, after learning about Sissy's murder, the question took on a chilling significance. The detectives now understood something crucial. The DNA on the sliding glass door hadn't come from some unknown intruder. It was touch DNA, transferred to the door handle after Jonathan had made physical contact with Miss Pumpkin and then touched the door. But was Miss Pumpkin involved in the murder itself? The detectives investigated thoroughly. The autopsy results showed that Sissy had been killed in the early morning hours of July 5th, not in the afternoon. During that time frame, Miss Pumpkin had an alibi. She was cleared as a suspect. The timeline was becoming clear. Jonathan had killed his wife in the early morning, staged the crime scene to look like a burglary, and then gone about his day as planned, including meeting with a sex worker before returning home to discover the body and call 911. Detectives returned to the Krupe home for another search. This time they were looking for specific items, and they found them. In a closet that had originally been blocked by Sissy's body, they discovered a throwaway cell phone in Jonathan's coat pocket. This was the phone he'd used to contact Miss Pumpkin, keeping his infidelity hidden from his wife. The phone records verified every call he'd made to the sex worker, creating a digital trail that was impossible to deny. The investigators built their case carefully, methodically. They had no eyewitness to the murder itself. The murder weapon, the kitchen knife that had been used to stab Sissy 15 times, was never found. Jonathan had presumably disposed of it somewhere or would never be recovered. But they had something perhaps even more powerful, a web of lies, each one unraveling to reveal the truth beneath. They had the DNA evidence placing Jonathan at the scene, and explaining the mysterious female DNA as transfer from his encounter with Miss Pumpkin. They had his internet search history showing premeditation, researching how to commit murder and clean up evidence. They had his fabricated alibi about picking up school supplies, contradicted by the school principal and security footage. They had his fake story about being at Home Depot, contradicted by Miss Pumpkin's testimony about their afternoon meeting. They had the staged crime scene that left valuable items behind, something no real burglar would have done. And they had motive. Sissy had discovered Jonathan's infidelity and his lies about attending graduate school. She had confronted him, and in the days leading up to her death, the tension between them had been palpable to everyone around them. On November 2012, 4 months after Sissy's murder, Jonathan Krupe was arrested at his parents' home in Brooklyn, where he'd been staying since the killing. He was charged with second-degree murder and criminal possession of a weapon. He maintained his innocence. It would take nearly 3 years for the case to go to trial. In June 2015, Jonathan Krupe finally faced a jury. The prosecution, led by acting Richmond County District Attorney Daniel Master Jr., presented their case with methodical precision. They argued that Jonathan had killed his wife in a fit of rage after she confronted him about his double life. The sex workers, the lies about graduate Ursula, the money she'd spent trying to help him that he'd squandered. They presented the computer search evidence, showing that Jonathan had researched how to commit murder months before Sissy's death. They called Miss Pumpkin to the stand, and she testified about Jonathan's urgent call on the day of the murder, about the strange question he'd asked about a man killing his wife. They explained the touch DNA on the sliding glass door, demonstrating how Jonathan's story about a burglary fell apart under scrutiny. They showed the jury the valuable items left behind, the credit cards, the blank checks, the engagement ring, then asked them to consider what kind of burglar would leave such things. And they painted a picture of Sissy, a dedicated teacher, a loving daughter and sister, a woman who had created the Fairy Godmothers Project to help students she knew couldn't afford prom dresses, a woman who had begged her school to hire her husband because she believed in him, even when he'd failed. The defense maintained that Sissy's death was the result of a burglary gone wrong, that Jonathan was innocent, and that the death had been accidental. They tried to poke holes in the prosecution's timeline, to suggest alternative explanations for the evidence. But the weight of that evidence was overwhelming. The trial lasted 5 weeks. The jury deliberated for just 2 hours. On September 23, 2015, they returned with their verdict: guilty of second-degree murder. In the courtroom, Sissy's family wept with relief and grief. Jonathan Krupe was sentenced to the maximum penalty, 25 years to life in prison. Even at his sentencing, Jonathan continued to maintain his innocence. He told the judge he hadn't killed his wife, that he'd been wrongly convicted. Neither the judge nor Sissy's family believed him. Today, Jonathan Krupe is incarcerated at the Clinton Correctional Facility in Dannemora, New York. He will not be eligible for parole until 2037, when he will be 55 years old. In 2016, in a move that outraged Sissy's family, Jonathan created a dating profile on a website called convictandpals.com. The profile boasted, "I'm not married and I don't have any kids. No baby mama drama here." When Sissy's mother, Teresa Mapes, learned about the profile, she was devastated. "He took my world away," she told reporters. "He destroyed my world. He destroyed my life. He destroyed my family. It's like my daughter meant nothing." The profile's final line was particularly haunting: "Take a chance and write me soon." In 2019, Jonathan filed an appeal, arguing that 2 search warrants used against him had been invalid. The appeal was denied. He remains in prison. Teresa Mapes channeled her grief into action, founding an organization called Sissy's Angels in honor of her daughter. The organization helps victims of domestic violence, continuing Sissy's legacy of helping others. At Sissy's funeral, hundreds of people came to say goodbye. Many were students whose lives she had touched, young people who might never have made it to prom or graduated high school without her quiet intervention. Her family learned details about her work that she'd never mentioned: the Fairy Godmothers Project, the countless small acts of kindness that had defined her teaching career. She had helped so many people, and she had never asked for anything in return. She loved life. She loved to have fun, her father said. She was just a 29-year-old kid who loved life. Her brother, John Mapes III, remembered her selflessness. She wasn't looking for recognition, and that's the epitome of what a good person should be. Sissy had survived a shootout in one of Brooklyn's toughest neighborhoods. She had dedicated her life to teaching students that others might have given up on. She had faced down violence and poverty and gang activity, always with that infectious laugh and unwavering commitment. But she couldn't survive the man she married, the man she trusted, the man she had tried to help build a better life. On July 5, 2012, 2 days before their 5th wedding anniversary, Jonathan Krupe pushed his wife down the stairs and stabbed her 15 times. Then he met with a sex worker, returned home, and called 911 to report that he'd found her dead. The case of Simeonette Mapes Krupe reminds us that danger doesn't always come from strangers in dark alleys or criminals in the projects. Sometimes it comes from the person sleeping beside you, the person who knows all your vulnerabilities, the person you've trusted with your whole heart. It reminds us that kindness, while a beautiful thing, cannot always protect us from cruelty. Sissy's laugh is silent now. The Fairy Godmothers Project continues without her. Her students have graduated and moved on, carrying pieces of her wisdom with them. Her family continues to grieve a loss that can never be made whole. But her story remains a testament to a life lived in service of others, cut short by betrayal, and ultimately a reminder that justice, though sometimes slow, can prevail. The sliding door that held the key to solving her murder stands as a metaphor for the case itself. A small detail, easily overlooked, that revealed the truth when examined closely enough. And somewhere in New Springville, Staten Island, the home where Sissy died stands as a reminder that evil can exist anywhere, hidden behind a mask of normalcy, waiting for the moment when secrets can no longer be kept. Please, if you're still awake, let's move on to our last story. Story 5. Tonight, I want to tell you about a case that reveals how desperation can corrupt judgment, how fear can twist familial bonds into something dark, and how one man's attempt to escape justice led to a tragedy that would shatter multiple families forever. This is the story of Jonathan Brenton, a devoted family man whose life was stolen on a September morning in Jacksonville, Florida. Not by a stranger in the night, but by people his daughter once called friends. Jonathan Wesley Brenton, Joe to everyone who knew him, was 48 years old in the summer of 2016. For 21 years, he had been a fixture at the University of North Florida, working as a senior information technology engineer. His colleagues knew him as meticulous, reliable, and deeply knowledgeable. He wasn't the kind of person who sought the spotlight. Instead, Joe was one of those rare individuals who formed the invisible backbone of an institution. His boss, Clay Maddox, would later remember him as instrumental in building the early network and server infrastructure at UNF. Joe had helped architect the campus network from its foundations, watching it grow and evolve as technology advanced. He took pride in his work, in knowing that thousands of students and faculty members relied on systems he had helped create and maintain. But Joe's real pride was his family. He lived with his wife, Venus, and their daughter, Josie, in a modest home on V.C. Johnson Road in Jacksonville's Ocean Way neighborhood. The street was quiet, a dead-end road north of Dunn Avenue where everyone knew their neighbors, where the kind of traffic you'd see was limited to residents and their invited guests. It was the kind of place where people moved specifically because they wanted peace, safety, a buffer from the chaos of the wider world. The Brenton home sat tucked away on this quiet street, a place that should have been a sanctuary. And for years it was. But like many families in America, the Brentons were navigating troubled waters. Their daughter, Josie, had struggled with substance abuse, a battle that had led her to drug rehabilitation. It was a source of quiet anguish for Joe and Venus, the kind of pain parents carry silently, hoping for better days, praying for their child's recovery. During this difficult period, Josie had befriended two young men, Jacorian McCrae and his stepbrother, Decorai Maxwell. They were acquaintances from the neighborhood, the kind of casual friends who drift into a young person's orbit. The Brentons, focused on their daughter's recovery, likely didn't think much about these friendships at first. They had bigger concerns. They were doing what parents do, supporting their child, hoping for the best, trying to guide her toward a healthier future. But these friendships would prove to be a doorway to catastrophe. January 29th, 2014. A cold Wednesday afternoon in Jacksonville. Joe and Venus Brenton had left their home that day to visit their daughter at a drug rehabilitation facility. It was one of those trips no parent wants to make, but makes anyway, because love demands it. They were trying to be present, trying to support Josie through her recovery journey. The house sat empty for a few hours. Just a few hours, but that was enough. When the Brentons returned home later that day, they immediately knew something was wrong. The telltale signs of invasion were everywhere. Drawers had been rifled through, cabinets stood open, personal belongings had been disturbed, moved, taken. The inventory of stolen items painted a disturbing picture. Expensive jewelry, blank checks from their checkbook, household appliances, and perhaps most concerning, prescription painkillers. The medications had likely been prescribed during Josie's struggle with addiction, kept in the home for legitimate medical purposes. Now they were gone, along with thousands of dollars worth of other valuables. Joe, methodical by nature and profession, did exactly what you'd expect from an IT engineer. He checked his home surveillance system. The cameras had been rolling all day, capturing everything in digital clarity. And there, preserved in pixels and timestamps, was the evidence of betrayal. The surveillance footage showed two young men moving through the Brenton home in the middle of the day. They weren't strangers wearing masks. They weren't unknown criminals who had somehow randomly selected this house. No, Joe recognized them immediately. They were Jacorian McCrae and Decorai Maxwell, his daughter's acquaintances, young men who had been to his home before as guests, who had sat at his table, who had been welcomed into his family's space. The footage was damning, irrefutable. It showed McCrae and Maxwell, who were stepbrothers, systematically going through the Brenton home, taking what they wanted. The cameras captured their faces, their movements, every detail that would later be needed to build a criminal case. Joe reported the burglary to the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office. He turned over the surveillance footage. He gave his statement, and then, like many victims of property crime, he waited for the criminal justice system to do its work. The wheels of justice, as they often do, turned slowly. Months passed, then a year, then nearly 2 years. For the Brentons, life continued in that strange way it does after a violation of home and trust. The burglary had shaken them, left them feeling exposed in a place that was supposed to be safe. But they carried on. Joe went to work at UNF every day. Venus maintained their household. They continued supporting their daughter through her recovery. The stolen items were gone, but life, resilient, persistent life, went on. Meanwhile, the criminal case against Jacorian McRae was making its way through the court system. McRae had been arrested and charged with a burglary. At the time of the break-in, he was 21 years old. His stepbrother, Jacori Maxwell, had been just 15, a juvenile at the time of the crime. The home surveillance footage was the prosecution's key evidence, and Joe Brenton was their primary witness. McRae was held in the Duval County Jail as his trial date approached. He had plenty of time to think, plenty of time to contemplate the potential consequences of his actions. And as someone with prior knowledge of the criminal justice system, he understood exactly what he was facing. Burglary charges with strong evidence against him could mean significant prison time. In McRae's mind, he was looking at anywhere from 15 to 30 years behind bars. The trial date was set, September 22, 2016, exactly 2 years and 1 day after the burglary itself. A jury was selected on Monday, September 19th. Everything was in place. Joe and Venus Brenton were scheduled to testify the following Wednesday. They would take the stand, explain what had been taken from their home, identify the suspects from the surveillance footage, and let justice take its course. It should have been straightforward. It should have been just another case in the endless machinery of the American legal system. But Jacorian McRae, sitting in a jail cell with a long sentence looming before him, was becoming increasingly desperate, and desperate people make dangerous decisions. Inside the Duval County Jail, every phone call is recorded. This is standard procedure, announced at the beginning of each call. Inmates are explicitly warned that their conversations are being monitored. This system exists for security purposes, to prevent the planning of crimes, to gather intelligence to maintain institutional safety. Jacorian McRae knew his calls were being recorded. He had been in jail long enough to understand how the system worked. But fear, it seems, overrode caution. Or perhaps he simply didn't believe anyone was actually listening. In jails and prisons across America, thousands of calls are made every single day. The sheer volume makes comprehensive monitoring nearly impossible. McRae gambled that his calls would get lost in the noise. In the days leading up to his trial, McRae began making a series of phone calls to two people: his 17-year-old stepbrother, Jacori Maxwell, and his girlfriend, 21-year-old Tierney Shelton. These conversations, preserved on the jail's recording system, would eventually paint a complete picture of premeditated murder. But first, McRae wanted to try something less permanent: bribery. According to the plan discussed in these recorded calls, Shelton would visit the Brenton home and attempt to convince Joe and Venus not to testify, or at least to change their statements. Money would be offered. Pressure would be applied. The message would be clear. McRae was facing 30 years in prison, and he needed the Brentons to reconsider their cooperation with prosecutors. On Tuesday, September 20, 2016, the day before Joe Brenton was scheduled to testify, Tierney Shelton arrived at the Brenton home around 5 o'clock in the evening. Imagine that scene for a moment. Joe and Venus, in their home on a quiet Tuesday evening, answering a knock at their door. There stands a young woman they likely recognized as McRae's girlfriend, someone connected to the crime that had violated their home 2 years earlier. And she's there with an offer. The details of that conversation aren't fully public, but according to arrest reports, Shelton's message was clear: take back your statements. Money's no object. Joe and Venus refused. They had already been victims once. They had already had their home violated, their belongings stolen, their sense of security shattered. Now they were being asked to compromise their integrity, to lie to a court, to let someone escape justice for crimes captured on their own security cameras. They said no. And when Tierney Shelton left the Brenton home that evening without having changed their minds, she made a phone call. She told Jacorian McRae that the bribery attempt had failed. The Brentons were still planning to testify. That's when McRae made a choice that would destroy multiple lives. Late Tuesday night, September 20th, 2016, Jacorian McRae called his 17-year-old stepbrother from jail. The recording of this conversation would later be played in court, and its contents were chilling in their specificity. McRae didn't speak in vague terms or abstract threats. He gave detailed, methodical instructions on how to commit murder. "I don't think you are going to do all that," McRae's voice said on the recording. "But that's why I'm telling you to knock on the door. So I'm telling you this is... I'm such and such and such and such and such a Jacksonville, you feel me? We are here to question you." And they're going to be like, And open that big boom, 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 boom. You feel me? He continued, his instructions becoming more explicit. When you see them come to that and you see their ass, you know that you got that see-through glass. Wet that up. Boom, 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 through that, you feel me? In another call, clearly anxious about his impending trial, McCrae asked Maxwell, "You still want that done?" Maxwell's response, asking for confirmation. McCrae didn't hesitate. "Hell yeah, call Peanut right now." Peanut was the nickname for Demetrius Ford, a 19-year-old friend who was being enlisted to help ensure the plan was carried out. Then came the most damning statement. "Yeah, I'm in the need, bro. I go to trial tomorrow. I ain't playing no games. Tomorrow is the day." Lieutenant Steve Gallagher of the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office would later describe these recorded conversations with stark clarity. He walked Takari step by step through the process of how to kill him. In the morning, the murder occurred, just like he was instructed to do. Think about what was happening in this moment. A 23-year-old man, facing prison time for burglary, was convincing his teenage stepbrother to commit murder. He was taking a 17-year-old, still legally a minor, still developing neurologically and emotionally, and turning him into a weapon. The family connection that should have been protective became the mechanism of manipulation. Takari Maxwell, for his part, agreed to do it. Whether it was loyalty to his stepbrother, fear of disappointing him, misguided love, or simply the poor judgment of adolescence, we may never fully understand. But he agreed. The stage was set, the plan was in motion, and in a few hours Joe Brenton would answer his door for the last time. It was early morning. Very early. The kind of darkness that sits heavy in the hours before dawn, when most of the world is still asleep. At 2:45 a.m., someone knocked on the door of the Brenton home on V.C. Johnson Road. Joe Brenton, awakened by the knocking, went to answer. Perhaps he looked through the peephole first. Perhaps he recognized the person outside as someone connected to his daughter. We don't know exactly what he saw or thought in those final moments. What we know is that he opened the door, and then just as Jacorian McCrae had instructed, gunfire erupted. The glass panels beside the door shattered. Multiple shots were fired, over 16 rounds according to later testimony. Joe Brenton was struck multiple times. He fell in the doorway of his home and the threshold between the safety he had tried to maintain and the violence that had come calling. Inside the house, Venus and Josie Brenton heard the shots. They called 911, their voices captured in recordings that would later be played in court. Imagine their terror. The sudden explosive violence, the realization of what had happened, the desperate attempt to help, to call for emergency services, to do something, anything. But it was too late. Joe Brenton was pronounced dead at the scene. He was 48 years old. He had woken up that morning, knowing he would testify in a burglary trial later that day. He would never make it to court. The Jacksonville Sheriff's Office responded to the 911 call just before 3:00 a.m. Officers arrived at the dead-end street in Ocean Way to find a crime scene that would quickly reveal itself as far more than a random home invasion. Neighbors awakened by the gunfire came out of their homes. Some of them would later tell reporters that they had suspected from the beginning. This wasn't a random crime. For me, I thought, well, it has to be more than a burglary, one neighbor, Greg Coisseau, later said. Everyone who came down V.C. Johnson Road either lived there or knew someone who did. This was a targeted attack, and the neighbors sensed it immediately. Detectives interviewed Venus and Josie Brenton, both in profound shock from what they had just witnessed. They canvassed the neighborhood for any surveillance footage or witnesses. They began piecing together the timeline of the evening, and then they learned about the scheduled testimony. Joe Brenton had been set to testify against Jacorian McCrae later that very day. The trial that had been prepared, the jury that had been seated, all of it would now have to be postponed because the primary witness had been murdered just hours before he was supposed to take the stand. The coincidence was too stark to ignore. Detectives immediately understood they were looking at witness intimidation taken to its ultimate extreme. The Jacksonville Sheriff's Office began pulling phone records. They requested the recordings of all jail calls made by Jacorian McCrae in the days leading up to the murder. And there, preserved in digital audio files, they found everything they needed. The conversations between McCrae and his stepbrother, Takari Maxwell, were explicit. The discussion of hiring Shelton to attempt bribery was there. The detailed instructions on how to carry out the murder were there. The involvement of Demetrius Ford was documented. The growing anxiety about the trial, the determination to eliminate Joe Brenton as a witness. All of it was captured in McCrae's own words. On Friday, September 23, 2016, just 2 days after the murder, the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office held a press conference to announce arrests in the case. 4 people were taken into custody. Jacorian McCrae, age 23, was charged with first-degree murder, despite being in jail during the actual shooting. He was being charged as the orchestrator of the crime. Dakarai Maxwell, age 17, was charged with first-degree murder as the alleged shooter. Though still a juvenile, he would be tried as an adult, given the severity of the crime. Tranny Shelton, age 21, was charged with tampering with a witness for her role in attempting to bribe the Brentons. Demetrius Ford, age 19, was charged with conspiracy to commit a capital felony for his role in facilitating the murder plot. At the press conference, Lieutenant Steve Gallagher laid out the evidence that had emerged from the jailhouse recordings. He explained how McCrae had become increasingly worried about being convicted and sentenced to substantial prison time, how he had tried bribery first, and when that failed, had ordered his teenage stepbrother to commit murder. He convinced them that they needed to convince the Brentons to either change their story or not testify, Gallagher explained. When he learned the bribery didn't work Tuesday night, he told Dakarai that he needed to kill him. The recordings, Gallagher said, amounted to a confession. McCrae had essentially documented his own crime, step by step, on monitored jail phone lines. One detail from the press conference stood out. A neighbor asked how these calls hadn't been flagged in real time. Why hadn't jail officials monitoring the calls caught the murder plot before it was executed? The answer, as crime analyst Jill Smith explained to reporters, was simply a matter of volume. Several phone calls are made every day from the jail. With limited resources and thousands of daily calls, real-time prevention of jailhouse plots remains extraordinarily difficult. Among those following the arrest with particular anguish was Tony Maxwell, father to Dakarai Maxwell, and stepfather to Jacorian McCrae. In interviews after the arrest, Tony Maxwell revealed that he had previously warned a judge about the dangerous influence McCrae wielded over his teenage son. He had seen the dynamic between the stepbrothers and had tried to intervene legally before things escalated to this point. "I'm still beating myself up now because I feel like I failed my son," Tony Maxwell said at the time. "Imagine being in his position. Your teenager has just been arrested for murder. Your adult stepson orchestrated it from jail. You had seen the warning signs, had tried to protect your child from this very influence. And it hadn't been enough." Tony Maxwell's statement captures one of the many tragedies radiating from this case. The victims weren't just the Brentons, though they certainly suffered the most profound loss. The destruction spread outward, claiming futures and families in widening circles. Dakarai Maxwell's future, whatever it might have been, was now foreclosed. At 17, he was facing life in prison for a murder he had been manipulated into committing by someone he should have been able to trust. The father who had tried to protect him was left with nothing but guilt and grief. At the University of North Florida, Joe Brenton's death sent shockwaves through the IT department and beyond. The university released a statement. "The UNF community is saddened by the news of Joe Brenton's passing, as he was a valued employee here for 21 years. He was instrumental in building the early network and server infrastructure at UNF and continued to architect the campus network until his untimely death. Our heartfelt prayers and thoughts go out to his family and friends." But beyond the official statement, there were personal griefs being processed. Clay Maddox, Joe's boss and colleague of more than a decade, received the phone call about Joe's death from Venus Brenton herself. It was a gut punch. Maddox would later say, "You could never expect that." He recalled how Joe had taken a couple of days off specifically for trial preparation and testimony. Joe had been doing his civic duty, fulfilling his obligation as a witness in a criminal case. He had gone through the proper channels, taken time off work, prepared to testify truthfully about a crime he had evidence of, and he had been murdered for it. Maddox remembered Joe as someone who had been instrumental in building UNF's early network and server infrastructure, the invisible foundation that allowed thousands of students and faculty to work and learn. Joe was the kind of employee organizations depend on, but often take for granted until they're gone. Now he was gone, not from retirement or illness or any of the normal ways people leave their jobs. He had been murdered, systematically and deliberately, to prevent him from speaking truth in a court of law. After the arrests in September 2016, The legal process stretched out over years. Capital murder cases moved slowly, with extensive pretrial proceedings, motions, and legal maneuvering. Jacorian McCrae and Dakari Maxwell both pleaded not guilty initially. The state attorney's office announced in September 2017 that they would seek the death penalty against McCrae, though not against Maxwell due to his age at the time of the crime. The years passed. 2017, 2018, 2019. In September 2019, 3 years after Joe Brenton's murder, the case still hadn't gone to trial. Both defendants remained in custody, awaiting their day in court. The Brenton family, meanwhile, lived with their loss, unable to find closure while the legal process ground slowly forward. Venus and Josie Brenton had to carry the weight of that night for years without resolution. They had lost a husband and father. Their home had become a crime scene. Their lives had been irrevocably altered by violence that could have been prevented if the justice system's warnings about recorded calls had actually deterred criminal planning. For the defendants, jail became a long-term reality. McCrae, notably, was arrested 5 additional times while incarcerated, for offenses including battery, attempted escape, and lewd and lascivious acts. His behavior behind bars suggested a person who continued to make destructive choices, even when facing a murder conviction. Finally, in May 2022, nearly 6 years after Joe Brenton's death, Jacorian McCrae's case went to trial. The prosecution's case was built on those recorded jailhouse calls. The jury heard McCrae's own voice giving detailed instructions to his teenage stepbrother on how to murder a witness. They heard the desperation in his words, the cold calculation of his planning, the progression from bribery to murder when the first approach failed. The defense couldn't dispute the recordings. Instead, they argued that McCrae hadn't pulled the trigger himself. He had been in jail at the time of the murder. He was not the shooter, but under Florida law, this distinction didn't matter. Someone who orders a murder is as guilty as the person who carries it out. The crime is called first-degree murder, regardless of who physically pulls the trigger. On Wednesday, May 11, 2022, opening statements began. Venus and Josie Brenton both testified. An emotional 911 call was played for the jury. The officers who responded to the scene described what they found, and crucially, Josie testified about her relationship with the defendants. She and Maxwell and McCrae were all friends, prosecutors noted. The defense emphasized this point too. These weren't strangers to each other. Josie had been best friends with the young men who conspired to kill her father. The testimony revealed that Maxwell had shot Joe Brenton more than 16 times. This wasn't a single shot in a moment of panic or poor judgment. This was sustained, deliberate violence, multiple magazines worth of ammunition fired at a man standing in his own doorway. The trial lasted several days. On Friday, May 13, 2022, the jury began deliberations around 3:30 in the afternoon. They didn't need long. On Monday, May 16, 2022, the jury returned with their verdict, guilty on all counts. Jacorian McCrae was convicted of first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and tampering with a witness. Because the jury found him guilty of first-degree murder, the next phase was the penalty phase. Would McCrae receive the death penalty as the prosecution had sought, or would he receive life in prison? After hearing additional testimony and deliberating on the sentence, the jury made their decision: life in prison without the possibility of parole. McCrae was spared the death penalty, but he would spend the rest of his natural life behind bars. He was 28 years old at the time of conviction. If he lives an average lifespan, he has 50 or more years ahead of him in prison, with no possibility of release, no hope of freedom. For the Brenton family, the verdict brought a measure of closure, though it could never bring Joe back. Venus and Josie had waited nearly 6 years for this day. 6 years of living with the knowledge that Joe had been murdered for doing the right thing, for refusing a bribe, for planning to testify truthfully, for fulfilling his civic obligation. The formal sentencing hearing would come later, but the outcome was decided. McCrae would die in prison. Dakari Maxwell's case took a different trajectory. While McCrae's trial proceeded, Maxwell's defense team worked toward a different resolution. In October 2022, Maxwell pleaded guilty to second-degree murder, rather than face trial for first-degree murder. This plea deal likely spared him from a mandatory life sentence, though he still faced decades in prison. His sentencing hearing was scheduled for February 2023. When that day came, Maxwell addressed the court. He apologized to both his family and the Brenton family. He took responsibility for his actions, though notably, he claimed he hadn't been the actual shooter, despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. It has been 6 years later I realized I was a puppet, Maxwell said in court, and I should have never engaged in those phone conversations. Your Honor, with that being said, I'm asking that you look at me as if I was 16 instead of 23. This statement revealed something important about Maxwell's psychology. He was now 23 years old, but he was asking the judge to see him as he had been when the crime occurred. 17, still a minor, still developing, he characterized himself as a puppet manipulated by his stepbrother, acting under influence rather than exercising independent judgment. There's truth in this characterization. Adolescent brains are not fully developed, particularly in areas related to impulse control and long-term consequence assessment. Maxwell was vulnerable to manipulation by someone he trusted. His stepbrother had wielded considerable influence over him, and his father had tried to warn the courts about exactly this dynamic. But regardless of mitigation, Maxwell had still made a choice. He had picked up a gun. He had driven to the Brenton home in the early morning hours. He had knocked on the door, and when Joe Brenton answered, Maxwell had opened fire, pulling the trigger over 16 times. Maxwell asked the judge if he could withdraw his guilty plea, a request that was denied. As legal expert Randy Reep explained to reporters, Maxwell had very limited options for withdrawing a plea after entering it, unless he could prove ineffective assistance of counsel or demonstrate an illegal sentence. The plea would stand. On February 3th, 2023, Maxwell was formally sentenced to life in prison. Like his stepbrother, he would spend the rest of his life behind bars for the murder of Joe Brenton. The other two defendants in the case, Tereni Shelton and Demetris Ford, faced their own legal proceedings for their roles in the conspiracy. Shelton had been charged with tampering with a witness for her role in attempting to bribe the Brentons on the evening before the murder. Both Shelton and Ford eventually pleaded guilty to their respective charges and cooperated with prosecutors, testifying against McRae during his trial. Their cooperation likely earned them reduced sentences, though the exact terms of their plea deals weren't extensively reported. They remain cautionary figures in this story. Young people who got swept up in a conspiracy to commit murder, who made terrible choices to help someone they cared about, and who will carry the consequences of those choices for the rest of their lives. Ford's role had been to ensure the murder was carried out as planned, a logistical facilitator in an act of extreme violence. Shelton had been the first line of approach, attempting to convince the Brentons to compromise their integrity and let a criminal escape justice. Neither had pulled the trigger, but both had contributed to creating the circumstances that led to Joe Brenton's death. In the architecture of this crime, they were supporting elements, not the foundation or the structure, but necessary components nonetheless. The murder of Jonathan Brenton raises profound questions about witness protection, jailhouse security, and the vulnerability of citizens who cooperate with criminal prosecutions. Joe Brenton did everything right. He had security cameras in his home that captured the burglary. He reported the crime to police. He cooperated with prosecutors. He agreed to testify. He followed every civic obligation that society asks of crime victims. And he was murdered for it. This case exposes a harsh reality. The criminal justice system cannot always protect those who cooperate with it. The recordings of jailhouse phone calls, while valuable for building cases after crimes occur, didn't prevent this particular crime. The warnings at the beginning of every jail call, "This call is being recorded and monitored," didn't deter Ja'Cory and McRae from explicitly planning a murder over those phone lines. Some questions linger. Why weren't the calls flagged in real time? With the volume of daily jail calls, real-time monitoring of every conversation is virtually impossible. But should there be better algorithms, better systems for detecting keywords or phrases that indicate imminent violence? Should mentions of testimony trigger automatic reviews? There are no easy answers. Privacy concerns, resource limitations, and the sheer scale of jail populations make comprehensive monitoring extraordinarily difficult. But cases like Joe Brenton's death made clear that gaps in the system exist, and people die because of them. The case also highlights the vulnerability of family members when someone is enmeshed in criminal activity. Josie Brenton had struggled with addiction, and in that vulnerable state, she had befriended people who would eventually murder her father. The drugs stolen from the Brenton home in the original burglary were likely her prescriptions. The connection that made the Brentons targets came through their daughter's associations. This isn't to blame Josie addiction. It's a disease, and the people who committed these crimes are solely responsible for their choices. But it illustrates how criminal connections can spread through social networks. How a family trying to support a loved one through recovery can suddenly find themselves in the crosshairs of violent offenders. At the University of North Florida, someone else now maintains the network infrastructure that Joe Brenton spent 2 decades building. Someone else troubleshoots the servers and manages the systems that keep the campus connected. But Joe's colleagues still remember him. Clay Maddox still thinks about the phone call he received from Venus Brenton that September morning. The gut punch that never quite goes away. On V.C. Johnson Road, the Brenton home sat vacant for a time after the murder. Neighbors reported seeing furniture piled at the curb. A dumpster in the front yard full of discarded belongings. The front door and window panes boarded up. Venus and Josie couldn't stay there. How could they? After what had happened in that doorway, the house that was supposed to be a sanctuary had become the site of an execution. The quiet street where neighbors knew each other, where traffic was limited to residents and their guests, had become the setting for premeditated murder. Eventually, new occupants likely moved into the house. Life continues, as it always does. But the history remains. Known to anyone who searches the address or asks the longtime neighbors, Joe Brenton's death left an absence that can never be filled. Venus lost her husband. Josie lost her father, killed by people she had considered friends. The University of North Florida lost a valued employee. Clay Maddox lost a colleague, and society lost another person who tried to do the right thing and paid the ultimate price for it. It's late now. The story is told. The perpetrators are in prison, serving life sentences for their crimes. But the costs continue to accumulate. Joe Brenton is still dead. He doesn't get to see his daughter's continued recovery, assuming she's found it. He doesn't get to retire from UNF after all those years of service. He doesn't get to grow old with Venus. All those futures, all those possibilities erased in a burst of gunfire on a September morning. Dickory Maxwell, now in his 20s, will spend the rest of his life in prison for murders he committed as a teenager under the influence of his stepbrother. Whatever he might have become, whoever he might have been, all of that is gone too, sacrificed to a moment of misguided loyalty and catastrophically poor judgment. Jacorian McCrae will die in prison, having destroyed multiple lives. Joe Brenton's most completely, but also his stepbrother's future. His girlfriend's freedom. His father's peace. His family's integrity. All because he couldn't face the consequences of a burglary he had actually committed. The surveillance footage from 2014 showed the truth. McCrae and Maxwell had broken into the Brenton home and stolen property. That was a fact, preserved in digital clarity. McCrae could have accepted responsibility, served his sentence, and eventually rebuilt his life. Instead, he chose to compound his crimes exponentially, turning a burglary case into a murder case, transforming what might have been a few years in prison into life without parole. The truth was always going to come out. Joe Brenton was always going to testify. The surveillance footage existed regardless of what happened to the witness. McCrae's attempt to silence Joe accomplished nothing except the destruction of a good man and the ruination of his own future and his brother's. This is the final irony of the case. Even after Joe Brenton's murder, McCrae was still convicted. The burglary trial was postponed, but eventually proceeded. The evidence still existed. The murder changed nothing about the underlying case, except to add infinitely more serious charges. Joe Brenton died for nothing. Nothing except one man's desperate, violent, ultimately futile attempt to escape accountability. In the years since Joe Brenton's murder, his case has become a reference point in discussions about witness protection and the challenges of prosecuting crimes. When witnesses fear retaliation, legal scholars and law enforcement officials have cited the case when arguing for stronger protections, better monitoring systems, and more resources dedicated to keeping witnesses safe. But these are abstract discussions, policy debates that happen in conference rooms and legislative chambers. They don't bring Joe back. They don't erase Venus and Josie's trauma. They don't restore the 21 years of expertise. Joe would have continued contributing to UNF. What remains are the lessons, if we're willing to learn them. The first lesson is about the fragility of safety. Joe Brenton did everything society asks of us. He had security cameras. He reported crimes. He cooperated with authorities. He agreed to testify, and he was murdered in his own doorway at 2:45 in the morning. If someone like Joe, cautious, prepared, cooperative, can be targeted and killed, then the illusion of safety through compliance is exactly that, an illusion. The second lesson is about manipulation and family dynamics. Jacorian McCrae didn't hire a stranger to commit this murder. He used his influence over his teenage stepbrother, exploiting family bonds and adolescent vulnerability to turn Decorai Maxwell into a killer. The person who should have been protecting Maxwell instead weaponized him. This dynamic plays out in criminal enterprises everywhere. Older family members recruiting younger ones, exploiting trust and loyalty for criminal purposes. The third lesson is about the limitations of surveillance systems. The jail recorded every call McCrae made. Warnings announced that conversations were being monitored. But the sheer volume of communications, combined with limited resources for real-time analysis, meant that McCrae's explicit murder instructions weren't intercepted until after Joe Brenton was already dead. Technology creates evidence, but it doesn't always prevent crimes. The fourth lesson is perhaps the most painful. Doing the right thing carries risk. We want to live in a world where cooperating with law enforcement is safe, where testifying in court is a civic duty without mortal consequences. But Joe Brenton's case demonstrates that this world doesn't fully exist. Witnesses are vulnerable, retaliation is real, and sometimes the price of truth is life itself. Thank you for listening to tonight's true crime story. Rest peacefully knowing that another story awaits you next time, ready to accompany you on another journey toward restorative sleep. But if you're still awake, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories. And until next time, stay safe and take care. Good night.